Greetings, superior beings, greetings, supreme being. We are all the human race. Our common enemy is death. Welcome on Try Something.Vegetarian. This is the broadcast US Psychological Operations PSYOPS PSYWAR and state-sponsored terrorism. So I'd like to begin my broadcast by claiming that I think that it's illegal to advocate a population reduction to 500 million like some people do in their book quotes and with their $1 million Georgia Guidestones. I've covered this in my previous broadcast about 50 shocking population reduction quotes on the Future channel, also here on YouTube, and that I strongly denounce, disapprove of any attacks in which innocent civilians get killed, whether they are part of state-sponsored terrorism or other operations, whether they're done by the state or by civilians. Plus, of course, it's still illegal, and in the US the death penalty is given to people, about 4% or something of these people that get the death penalty, about 4% of them are innocent, so then they argue it's still the best way to deal with it. So having said that, we can study the Wikipedia, CIA, Vatican edited encyclopedia articles. Psychological Operations United States #black_psyop. So this is one article that I will study. For example, I just saw that a few moments ago. You have white psyops, grey psyops, black psyops. Psychological operations are operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. So it can even mess with their objective reasoning, or is it just improving our objective reasoning? So we'll read it in a few seconds, mere seconds away from pure pleasure. Psychological warfare, PSYWAR, further explained, and of course state-sponsored terrorism. I have a list here, so Iran, North Korea, Sudan, Syria, Cuba, Iraq, Libya, and South Yemen may also be involved in state-sponsored terrorism, and this might only be a list of the things that are known to the governments or whoever created this Wikipedia list, this Wikipedia encyclopedia. The CIA and Vatican has edited it, but there may be others that have worked on this. And of course the United States and state-sponsored terrorism article, and we can just read these things. So I'm going to do that with the text-to-speech engine, including the contents. Let's use the end button. Not the alt left nor the alt right button nor the space bar are used at this time.
Psychological operations, PSYOP, are operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of United States psychological operations is to induce or reinforce behavior favorable to U.S. objectives. They are an important part of the range of diplomatic, informational, military and economic activities available to the U.S. They can be utilized during both peacetime and conflict. There are three main types: strategic, Operational and tactical. Strategic PSYOP include informational activities conducted by the U.S. government agencies outside of the military arena, though many utilize Department of Defense, DoD, assets. Operational PSYOP are conducted across the range of military operations, including during peacetime, in a defined operational area to promote the effectiveness of the Joint Force Commanders, JFC, campaigns and strategies. Tactical PSYOP are conducted in the area assigned to a tactical commander across the range of military operations to support the tactical mission against opposing forces. PSYOP can encourage popular discontent with the opposition's leadership and by combining persuasion with a credible threat, degrade an adversary's ability to conduct or sustain military operations. They can also disrupt, confuse, and retract the adversary's decision-making process, undermining command and control. 1. When properly employed, PSYOP have the potential to save the lives of friendly or enemy forces by reducing the adversary's will to fight, by lowering the adversary's morale and then its efficiency. PSYOP can also discourage aggressive actions by creating disaffection within their ranks, ultimately leading to surrender. The integrated employment of the core capabilities of electronic warfare, computer network operations, psychological operations, military deception, and operations security, in concert with specified supporting and related capabilities, to influence, disrupt, corrupt or usurp adversarial human and automated decision-making while protecting our own. 2. Between 2010 and 2014, PSYOP was renamed Military Information Support Operations, MISO, then briefly renamed PSYOP in August 2014, only to return to MISO shortly thereafter in 2015. 3-4. Contents 1 Products 1.1 White PSYOP 1.2 Gray PSYOP 1.3 Black PSYOP 1.4 Media 2 Process 3 Psychological Operations Units 3.1 Army 3.1.1 Army Units 3.1.2 Inactive Units 3.2 Navy 3.3 Air Force 3.4 Central Intelligence Agency 4 History of U.S. Psychological Warfare 4.1 World War I 4.2 World War II 5 Cold War 5.1 Radio 5.2 Korea 5.3 Guatemala 5.4 Vietnam 5.5 Nicaragua 5.6 Sweden 5.7 Grenada and Panama 5.8 The 1991 Gulf War 5.9 Bosnia-Herzegovina 5.10 Operation Observant Compass 6 Controversies 6.1 CNN and NPR Interns Incident 6.2 Toppling of Saddam Hussein Statue 6.3 Use of music in the interrogation of prisoners 6.4 Afghanistan Burning Bodies Incident 6.5 Pentagon Analysts in the Mainstream Media 6.6 2009 Congressional Delegation to Afghanistan 7 Portrayals in Popular Culture 8 See also 9 References 10 Further reading 10.1 Bibliography 10.2 Propaganda 11 External links Products. A Somali boy holding up a leaflet dispersed during Operation Restore Hope in the early 1990s. PSYOP involves the careful creation and dissemination of a product message. There are 3 types of products that are used to create these messages. They include white products which are used in overt operations and gray and black products which are used in covert PSYOP. White, gray, and black don't refer to the product's content but rather the methods used to carry out the operation. In order for PSYOP to be successful they must be based in reality. All messages must be consistent and must not contradict each other. Any gap between the product and reality will be quickly noticed. A credible truth must be presented which is consistent to all audiences. Primarily it is a component of offensive counter-information but can be used defensively as well. PSYOP are used in support of special operations, unconventional warfare, and counterinsurgency, COIN, operations. PSYOP can include military operations other than warfare and also include joint operations. They include counterterrorism.
So covert is basically hidden, not openly acknowledged or displayed. Semper Occultus, the motto of MI6, etc.
Operations, peace operations, non-combatant evacuation, enforcement of sanctions and maritime interception operations, strikes and raids, etc. White PSYOP, U.S. Army PSYOP soldiers with Detachment 1080, 318th Psychological Operations Company distribute newspaper products in the East Rashid region of Baghdad, Iraq, July 11, 2007. White PSYOP is attributable to PSYOP as a source. White is acknowledged.
So you have the white PSYOP that is overt, open, not hidden, and the gray that is partially hidden, and the black PSYOP that's totally secret, top secret operations, I think.
As an official statement or act of the U.S. government, or emanates from a source associated closely enough with the U.S. government to reflect an official viewpoint. The information should be true and factual. It also includes all output identified as coming from U.S. official sources. Authorized to engage in white activity directed at foreign audiences are the State Department, USIA, the Foreign Operations Administration, a predecessor of the Agency for International Development, the Defense Department, and other U.S. government departments and agencies as necessary. 5. Gray PSYOP. The source of the gray PSYOP product is deliberately ambiguous. The true source, U.S. government, is not revealed to the target audience. The activity engaged in plausibly appears to emanate from a non-official American source, or an indigenous, non-hostile source, or there may be an attribution. Gray is that information whose content is such that the effect will be increased if the hand of the U.S. government and in some cases any American participation are not revealed. It is simply a means for the U.S. to present viewpoints which are in the interest of U.S. foreign policy, but which will be acceptable or more acceptable to the intended target audience than will an official government statement. 5. Black PSYOP. The activity engaged in appears to emanate from a source, government, party, group, organization, person, usually hostile in nature. The interest of the U.S. government is concealed and the U.S. government would deny responsibility. It is best used in support of strategic plans. Covert PSYOP is not a function of the U.S. military but instead is used in special operations due to their political sensitivity and need for higher-level compartmentalization. Further, black PSYOP, to be credible, may need to disclose sensitive material, with the damage caused by information disclosure considered to be outweighed by the impact of successful deception. 6. In order to achieve maximum results and to prevent compromise of overt PSYOP, overt and covert operations need to be kept separate. Personnel involved in one must not be engaged in the other. Media PSYOP conveys messages via visual, audio, and audio-visual media. Military psychological operations, at the tactical level, are usually delivered by loudspeaker, and face-to-face communication. For more deliberate campaigns, they may use leaflets, radio or television. Strategic operations may use radio or television broadcasts, various publications, airdrop leaflets, or, as part of a covert operation, with material placed in foreign news media process. In order to create a successful PSYOP, the following must be established. Clearly define the mission so that it aligns with national objectives. Need a PSYOP estimate of the situation. Prepare the plan. Media selection. Product development. Pre-testing determines the probable impact of the PSYOP on the target audience. Production and dissemination of PSYOP material. Implementation. Post-testing evaluates audience responses. Feedback. Before these steps can occur, intelligence analysts must profile potential targets in order to determine which ones it would be most beneficial to target. In order to figure this out, analysts must determine the vulnerabilities of these groups and what they would be susceptible to. The analysts also determine the attitudes of the targets toward the current situation, their complaints, ethnic origin, frustrations, languages, problems, tensions, attitudes, motivations, and perceptions, and so on. Once the appropriate targets have been determined, the PSYOP can be created. Psychological operations should be planned carefully, in that even a tactical message, with modern news media, can spread worldwide and be treated as the policy of the United States. The U.S. Army is responsible for military psychological warfare doctrine. 6. See the World War I section for an example of how a tactical leaflet, not properly coordinated, can cause national-level harm. Psychological operations, at any level, must be consistent with the policies of higher levels of command. The message to be delivered can be adapted to tactical situations, but promises made must be consistent with national policy. U.S. PSYOP forces are forbidden to target, that is, attempt to change the opinions of, U.S. citizens at any time, in any location globally, or under any circumstances. 7. However, commanders may use PSYOP forces to provide public information to U.S. audiences during times of disaster or crisis. The use of PSYOP forces to deliver necessary public information to a U.S. audience was established in relief activities after Hurricane Andrew in 1992. Tactical Psychological Operations Teams, TPTs, were employed to disseminate information by loudspeaker on locations of relief shelters and facilities. Information support to a non-combatant evacuation operation, NEO, by PSYOP forces to provide evacuation information to U.S. and third country nationals would also adhere to the order. 6. As an example of the use of PSYOP in a humanitarian relief operation, Major General Anthony Zinni, Director of Operations for Unified Task Force Somalia, said, "Psychological operations were a key battlefield operating system used extensively to support Unified Task Force, UNITAF, Somalia operations. In order to maximize the PSYOP impact, we established a joint PSYOP task force under the supervision of the Director of Operations, integrated PSYOP into all plans and operations, and limited the PSYOP focus to the operational and tactical levels. Psychological operations did not accomplish missions alone. They work best when they are combined with and integrated in an overall theater campaign plan. In Operation Restore Hope, we were successful in doing that." 6. Psychological Operations Units. The majority of U.S. military psychological operations units are in the Army. White PSYOP can come from the Voice of America or regional radio, TV. Central Intelligence Agency units are appointed to have responsibility, on a strategic level, for black and some gray PSYOP. White PSYOP, especially at the strategic level, comes from the Voice of America or United States Information Agency. In the United States Department of Defense, psychological operations units exist as the Army's 4th Psychological Operations Group, 8th Psychological Operations Group, and Air Force with Commando Solo Units 8, under the Air Force Special Operations Command's 193rd Special Operations Wing. The United States Navy also plans and executes limited PSYOP missions. 9. United States PSYOP units and soldiers of all branches of the military are prohibited by law from conducting PSYOP missions on domestic audiences. 7. While PSYOP soldiers may offer non-PSYOP related support to domestic military missions, PSYOP can only target foreign audiences, though, it is worth noting that this does not rule out PSYOP targeting foreign audiences of allied nations. Additionally, in the Information Operations Roadmap made public January 2006 but originally approved by Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in October 2003, it stated information intended for foreign audiences, including public diplomacy and PSYOP, increasingly is consumed by our domestic audience and vice versa. 10. Army, Chuhoi Mission by Craig L. Stewart, U.S. Army Vietnam Combat Artists Team 9. Cat 9 1969-70. Painting shows Army soldiers airdropping PSYOP leaflets during the Vietnam War. Soldiers from the U.S. Army's 350th Tactical Psychological Operations, 10th Mountain Division, dropped leaflets over a village near Hoja in Kirkuk Province, Iraq, on March 6, 2008. U.S. Army PSYOP force structure. Until shortly after the start of the War on Terror, the Army's psychological operations elements were administratively organized alongside civil affairs to form the U.S. Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, USACAPOC, forming a part of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, USASOC. However, in May 2006 USCAPOC was reorganized to instead fall under the Army Reserve Command, and all active duty PSYOP elements were placed directly into USASOC. While reserve PSYOP forces no longer belong to USASOC, That command retains control of PSYOP doctrine. Operationally, PSYOP individuals and organizations support Army and Joint Maneuver Forces or interagency organizations. Army Psychological Operations provide support to operations ranging from strategic planning down to tactical employment. PSYOP units generally support corps-sized elements. Tactical Psychological Operations companies typically support division-sized elements. With tactical control through G3, brigades are typically supported by a tactical PSYOP detachment. The PSYOP commander maintains operational control of PSYOP elements, advises the commander and general staff on the psychological battlespace. The smallest organizational PSYOP element is the Tactical PSYOP Team, TPT. A TPT generally consists of a PSYOP team chief, staff sergeant or sergeant, an assistant team chief, sergeant or specialist, and an additional soldier to serve as a gunner and to operate the speaker system, specialist. A team is equipped with a Humvee fitted with a loudspeaker, and often works with a local translator indigenous to the host or occupied country. Generally, each maneuver battalion-sized element in a theater of war or operational area has at least one TPT attached to it. U.S. Army PSYOP branch of service color insignia and regimental distinctive insignia. All active duty PSYOP soldiers must initially volunteer for Psychological Operations Assessment and Selection, held year-round at Camp Mackle. Upon selection for Psychological Operations, soldiers then enter the Psychological Operations Qualification Course, POC, or Q course consisting of Special Operations Language Training, Advanced Cultural and Regional Studies, MOS specific training, Special Operations Particular training along with a culmination exercise which incorporates and validates the new skill sets attained by the soldier. At the conclusion of the POC, the new PSYOP soldier is typically assigned to either 4th Psychological Operations Group or 8th Psychological Operations Group. Certain reserve soldiers serving in units designated as airborne are also required to attend airborne training, while language training and airborne qualification for PSYOP soldiers assigned to non-airborne units is awarded on a merit and need basis. A U.S. Army Field Manual released in January 2013 states that inform and influence activities are critical for describing, directing, and leading military operations. Several Army Division leadership staff are assigned to planning, integration and synchronization of designated information-related capabilities. 11. Army Units. 345th PSYOP Company, pictured left to right, SBC Jeffrey A. Cogbill, SBC William O'Connell, CPL Ryan Lewis, United States Army Reserve, handout school supplies in Baghdad, Iraq, 2005. There are 4 Psychological Operations units in the U.S. Army. 2nd Psychological Operations Group, 4th Psychological Operations Group, Airborne, 7th Psychological Operations Group, 8th Psychological Operations Group, Airborne, the 4th Psychological Operations Group, Airborne, based at Fort Bragg, was historically the only active duty PSYOP unit in the United States Army, until the August 26, 2011 activation of 8th Psychological Operations Group, Airborne. The 2nd and the 7th Psychological Operations Groups are in the Army Reserve. Inactive units 245th Psychological Operations Company, BOC, Dallas, Texas reactivated and became the 345th PSYOP Company. Deployed soldiers during Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War. The 345th also deployed post 9/11 to Afghanistan working with U.S. Army Special Forces and Conventional Forces. In 2003 the 345th deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Since November 2001, the 345th Tactical Psychological Operations Company, Airborne, has deployed detachments of soldiers to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom, 2008 to 2009, Iraq, and the Horn of Africa. 244th Psychological Operations Company, BOC, deployed soldiers during Operation Desert Storm, the Gulf War. Navy Psychological Operations Policy is specified in UPNAVINS 3434.1, Psychological Operations. 9. The Navy provides support to joint PSYOP programs by providing assets, such as broadcast platforms using shortwave and very high frequency, VHF, frequencies, for the production and dissemination of PSYOP materials. With the ability of naval vessels, especially the larger task forces, to produce audiovisual materials, the Navy can often produce PSYOP products for use in denied areas. Leaflets are dropped utilizing the PDU-5B dispenser unit, aka leaflet bomb. The Navy coordinates extensively with the Army as the majority of PSYOP assets reside within USASOC. PSYOP planning and execution is coordinated through the Naval Network Warfare Command, NETWARCOM, and the Naval Information Operations Command, NIOC, both located in Norfolk, VA. The U.S. Navy possesses the capability to produce audiovisual products in the Fleet Audiovisual Command, Pacific, the Fleet Imagery Command, Atlantic, the Fleet Combat Camera Groups, Naval Imaging Command, various film libraries, and limited capability from ships and aircraft of the fleet. A Naval Reserve PSYOP audiovisual unit supports the Atlantic Fleet. Navy personnel assets have the capability to produce documents, posters, articles, and other material suitable for PSYOP. Administrative capabilities exist ashore and afloat that prepare and produce various quantities of printed materials. Language capabilities exist in naval intelligence and among naval personnel for most European and Asian languages. The Fleet Tactical Readiness Group provides equipment and technical maintenance support to conduct civil radio broadcasts and broadcast jamming in the amplitude modulation frequency band. This unit is not trained to produce PSYOP products and must be augmented with PSYOP personnel or linguists when necessary. The unit is capable of being fully operational within 48 hours of receipt of tasking. The unit's equipment consists of a 10.6 kW AM band broadcast radio transmitter, a broadcast studio van, antenna tuner, 2 antennas, an automatically raised 100-foot, 30 meters, top-loaded antenna mast and a 500-foot, 150 meters, wire helium balloon antenna, and a 30 kW generator that provides power to the system. Air Force. Commando Solo flies low over the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor in 2001. The Air National Guard provides support for psychological operations using a modified C-130 Hercules aircraft named DC-130 Commando Solo, operated by the 193d Special Operations Wing. The purpose of Commando Solo is to provide an aerial platform for broadcast media on both television and radio. The media broadcast is created by various agencies and organizations. As part of the border function of information operations, Commando Solo can also jam the enemy's broadcasts to his own people, or his psychological warfare broadcasting. The Commando Solo aircraft currently is the only standoff, high-altitude means available to PSYOP forces to disseminate information to large denied areas. 2 orbits were established during Operation Iraqi Freedom, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, one in the northern area and one in the southern part of the country, both far enough from harm's way to keep the aircraft out of reach of potential enemy attack. At their operational altitude of 18,000 feet, 5,500 meters, and assuming clear channels, these aircraft can transmit radio and TV signals approximately 170 miles, 270 kilometers, which does not reach the objective areas near Baghdad. Straightforward physics dictate the range, given the power installed in the antenna configuration and assuming clear channels. The enhanced altitude capability of the Commando Solo at 130 joules, now funded, is increasing transmitter range. While this is an improvement over 130 capability, it is a small step, since the increase in altitude is only 7,000 feet, less than 50%. And the range increase is governed by a square root function, that is, a 14% increase in range. 12. A challenge to Commando Solo is the increasing use of cable television, which will not receive signals from airborne, ground, or any other transmitters that the cable operator does not want to connect to the system. At best, in the presence of cable TV, Commando Solo may be able to jam enemy broadcasts that are not, themselves, transmitted by cable. Central Intelligence Agency Psychological Operations was assigned to the pre-CIA Office of Policy Coordination, with oversight by the Department of State. 13. The overall psychological operations of the United States, overt and covert, were to be under the policy direction of the U.S. Department of State during peacetime and the early stages of war. The Secretary of State shall be responsible for 1. The formulation of policies and plans for a national foreign information program in time of peace. This program shall include all foreign information activities conducted by departments and agencies of the U.S. government. 13. 2. The formulation of national psychological warfare policy in time of national emergency and the initial stages of war. 13. 3. The coordination of policies and plans for the National Foreign Information Program and for overt psychological warfare with the Department of Defense, with other appropriate departments and agencies of the U.S. government, and with related planning. 13. 4. Plans prepared by this organization for overt psychological warfare in time of national emergency or the initial stages of war shall provide for 13. A. Coordination of overt psychological warfare with covert psychological warfare, censorship, domestic information. 13. B. The employment and expansion, insofar as is feasible, of the activities and facilities which compose the National Foreign Information Program in time of peace, in order to assure a rapid transition to operations in time of national emergency or war. 13. C. Control of the execution of approved plans and policies by 1. The Department of Defense in theaters of military operations. 2. The Department of State in areas other than theaters of military operations. 13. D. Transmittal of approved psychological warfare plans and policies to theater commanders through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. 13. After the OPC was consolidated into the CIA. 5. There has been a Psychological Operations Staff, under various names, in what has variously been named the Deputy Directorate of Plans, the Directorate of Operations, or the National Clandestine Service. History of U.S. Psychological Warfare. World War I. During World War I, the propaganda subsection was established under the American Expeditionary Force, IF, military intelligence branch within the Executive Division of the General Staff in early 1918. Although they produced most propaganda, the IF propaganda subsection did not produce a few of the leaflets. General Pershing is supposed to have personally composed leaflet Why Austria is Out of the War, which was run off on First Army presses, but distributed by the propaganda subsection. That subsection, perhaps reflecting some professional jealousy, thought the leaflet sound in principle, but too prolix and a little too brotherly. Corps and Army presses issued several small leaflet editions containing a news flash, after the subsection had approved their content. But in one or two cases that approval was not obtained, and in one unfortunate example a leaflet in Romanian committed the Allies and the United States to the union of all Romanians in Austria-Hungary with Romania. Such geopolitics was emphatically not the job of propaganda and had the potential to cause serious embarrassment. 6. World War II. There was extensive use of psychological operations in World War II, from the strategic to the tactical. National level white propaganda was the responsibility of the Office of War Information, while black propaganda was most often the responsibility of the Morale Operations Branch of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. 14. Psychological operations planning started before the U.S. entry into the war, with the creation of the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, OCHA, under Nelson Rockefeller, with the responsibility for psychological operations targeted at Latin America. 15. Special operations and intelligence concerning Latin America was a bureaucratic problem throughout the war, where the OSS eventually had most such responsibilities. The FBI had its own intelligence system in Latin America. On July 11, 1941, William Donovan was named the Coordinator of Information, which subsequently became the OSS. At first, there was a unit called the Foreign Information Service inside COI, headed by Robert Sherwood, which produced white propaganda outside Latin America. 15. To deal with some of the bureaucratic problems, the Office of War Information, OWL, was created with Elmer Davis as director. FIS, still under Sherwood, became the overseas branch of OWL, dealing in white propaganda. The OSS was created at the same time. Donovan obtained considerable help from the British, especially with black propaganda, from the British Political Warfare Executive, PWE, part of the Ministry of Economic Warfare. PWE was a sister organization to the Special Operations Executive, which conducted guerrilla warfare. The British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, also known as MI6, was an essentially independent organization. For the U.S., the OSS included the functions of SIS and SO, and the black propaganda work of PWE. The OSS Morale Operations, MO, branch was the psychological operations arm of the OSS. In general, its units worked on a theater-by-theater basis, without a great deal of central coordination. 15. It was present in most theaters, with the exception of the Southwest Pacific Theater under Douglas MacArthur, who was hostile to the OSS. The OSS was responsible for strategic propaganda, while the military commanders had operational and tactical responsibility. Dwight Eisenhower was notably supportive of psychological operations, had psychological warfare organization in the staff of all his commands, and worked with OSS and OA. 15. The military did theater-level white propaganda, although the black propaganda function varied, often carried out by joint U.S.UK organizations. For the first time in U.S. history, American Psy warriors employed electronic PSYWAR in the field. In September 1944, engineers of the 1st Radio Section of the 1st MRBC recorded POW interviews for frontline broadcasts, and reproduced the sound effects of vast numbers of tanks and other motor vehicles for Allied armored units in attempts to mislead German intelligence and lower enemy morale. 6. Leaflets were delivered principally from aircraft, but also with artillery shells. 16. Cold War Radio main article, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The U.S. engaged in major worldwide radio broadcasts to combat communism, through Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. 17-18, Korea. U.S. Army loudspeaker team in action in Korea. Psychological operations were used extensively during the Korean War. The first unit, the 1st Loudspeaker and Leaflet Company, was sent to Korea in fall 1950. 1920, especially for the operations directed against troops of the Democratic Republic of Korea, DPRK, North Korea, it was essential to work with Republic of Korea, ROK, South Korea personnel, to develop propaganda with the most effective linguistic and cultural context. Since the war was a United Nations mandated operation, political sensitivities were high. While rules limited mentioning the People's Republic of China or the Soviet Union, first due to fear it would increase their intervention, and later because it might demoralize ROK civilians, Stalin was depicted and Chinese troops were targeted in leafleting. 2021. Various methods were used to deliver propaganda, with constraints imposed by exceptionally rugged terrain and that radios were relatively uncommon among DPRK and PRC troops. Loudspeaker teams often had to get dangerously close to enemy positions. Artillery and light aircraft delivered leaflets on the front lines, while heavy bombers dropped leaflets in the rear. Over 2.5 billion leaflets were dropped over North Korea during the war. 19. There was a somewhat artificial distinction made between strategic and tactical leaflets, rather than differentiating by the message. Tactical leaflets were delivered within 40 miles, 64 kilometers, of the front lines, and strategic leaflets were those delivered farther away. Less direct and immediate correlation between tactical PSYOP efforts and target audience behavior may still be substantiated after the fact, especially by means of polling and interviews. For example, in the Korean War, approximately 1/3 of the total prisoner of war, POW, population polled by the United Nations, UN, forces claim to have surrendered at least in part because of the propaganda leaflets. The contributions of PSYOP in the First Persian Gulf War have also been corroborated through POW interviews. 98% of the 87,000 POWs captured either possessed or had seen PSYOP leaflets that provided them with instructions on how to approach U.S. troops to surrender. 58% of the prisoners interviewed claimed to have heard coalition radio broadcasts, and 46% believed that the coalition broadcasts were truthful despite coming from their enemy. Again, Some portion of the surrenders might have occurred even without PSYOP encouragement, but certainly, there would appear to be a correlation between PSYOP, which offered the enemy a way to escape the onslaught of U.S. military power, and their compliance with those instructions. 12. One such operation is Operation PSYWAR. The objective of the psychological operation was to target communist pilots to defect to South Korea with a MiG-15, in order for the U.S. to conduct analysis of the capabilities of the MiG. Some leafleting of North Korea was resumed after the Korean War, such as in the Cold War Operation Gilly from 1964 to 1968. 22. Guatemala. The CIA's operation to overthrow the government of Guatemala in 1954 marked an early zenith in the agency's long record of covert action, following closely on two successful operations, one of which was the installation of the Shah as ruler of Iran in August 1953. The Guatemalan operation, known as Success, was both more ambitious and more thoroughly successful than either precedent. Rather than helping a prominent contender gain power with a few inducements, Success used an intensive paramilitary and psychological campaign to replace a popular, elected government with a political nonentity. In method, scale and conception it had no antecedent, and its triumph confirmed the belief of many in the Eisenhower administration that covert operations offered a safe, inexpensive substitute for armed force in resisting what they declared was communist inroad in the Third World. 23. Vietnam. Psychological operations were extensively used in Vietnam, with white propaganda under the United States Information Agency and Military Assistance Command Vietnam, and gray and black propaganda under the Central Intelligence Agency and the Studies and Observation Group. As early as August 1964, almost 1 year before the activation of the Joint U.S. Public Affairs Office, JUSPAO, General William Westmoreland told a California and PSYOP conference that psychological warfare and civic action are the very essence of the counterinsurgency campaign here in Vietnam. You cannot win this war by military means alone. Westmoreland's successor, Creighton Abrams, is known to have sent down guidelines to the 4th Psychological Operations Group that resulted in the drawing up of no fewer than 17 leaflets along those lines. In fact, the interest in PSYOP went all the way up to the presidency. Weekly reports from JUSPAO were sent to the White House, as well as to the Pentagon and the ambassador in Saigon. In sum, it is a myth that the United States, stubbornly fixated on a World War II-style conventional war, was unaware of the other war. 6. Safe Conduct Pass. During the Vietnam era, the organization of the 4th Psychological Operations Group was very different. The 4 battalions of the group were divided by geographic region rather than area of expertise as they are now. The 6th PSYOP Battalion was stationed at Bien Ho and provided services to the tactical units, both American and Vietnamese, and to the various political entities such as provinces and cities in the area of 3 Corps. The 7th PSYOP Battalion was stationed in Da Nang and provided service to I Corps. The 8th PSYOP Battalion was based at Nha Trang, but its B Company, which was its field teams, was based out of Pleca nearly 100 kilometers away. The 8th Battalion served the 2 Corps area of Vietnam. The 10th PSYOP Battalion was stationed in Kim Tho and served 4 Corps. The company of each battalion consisted of a command section, S1, S2, S3, and a PSYOP Development Center, PDC. Additionally, they generally had extensive printing facilities. The B companies consisted of the field teams that were stationed throughout their respective corps billeted with MACV teams and combat units. Nicaragua. The CIA wrote a manual for right-wing rebels, the Contras, entitled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare in order to bolster their fight against the Marxist-Sandinistas. See also CIA activities in Nicaragua. Sweden. Ola Tunander, a Swedish author, claimed that U.S. submarines as well as other vessels frequently and regularly operated in the territorial waters of neutral Sweden in the early 1980s, including Stockholm Harbor, as part of an elaborate psychological warfare operation whose target was the Swedish people. It is claimed that U.S. operations were conducted by the National Underwater Reconnaissance Office, NURO, and aspects of the operations were coordinated with the secret NATO stay-behind network deployed in Sweden. See Strategy of Tension and Operation Gladio. It is also claimed that British submarines also participated in such secret operations. 24. Grenada and Panama. Most PSYOP activities and accomplishments in Panama were hardly noticed by either the U.S. public or the general military community, but the Special Operations community did notice. The lessons learned in Panama were incorporated into standard operating procedures. Where possible, immediate changes were made to capitalize on the PSYOP successes of the Grenada and Panama operations. This led to improved production, performance, and effect in the next contingency, which took place within 6 months after the return of the last PSYOP elements from Panama. Operations, in Iraq, employed PSYOP of an order of magnitude and effectiveness which many credit to the lessons learned from Panama. 6. The broader scope of information operations in Panama included denying the Noriega regime use of their own broadcasting facilities. A direct action mission removed key parts of the transmitters. 25. After-action reports indicate that this action should have had a much higher priority and been done very early in the operation. An unusual technique, developed in real time, was termed the Mabel mission, or, more formally, capitulation missions. There were a number of Panamanian strongpoints that continued to have telephone access. By attaching Spanish-speaking Special Forces personnel to a combat unit that would otherwise take the strongpoint by force, the Spanish-speaking personnel would phone the Panamanian commander, tell him to put away his weapons and assemble his men on the parade ground, or face lethal consequences. Because of the heavy reliance on telephones, these missions were nicknamed Mabel operations. During this 10-day period, TF Black elements were instrumental in the surrender of 14 cartels, strongpoints, almost 2,000 troops, and over 6,000 weapons without a single U.S. casualty. Several high-ranking cronies of Manuel Noriega who were on the most wanted list were also captured in Mabel operations. 25. Psychological operations sometimes are intimately linked to combat operations, with the use of force driving home the propaganda mission. During the Panamanian operation, it was necessary. In Ft. Amador, an installation shared by the U.S. and Panamanian Defense Forces, PDF, there were U.S. dependents at the installation, but security considerations prevented evacuating them before the attack. Concern for U.S. citizens, and rules of engagement, RO, that directed casualties be minimized. PSYOP loudspeaker teams, from the 1st BN, 4th PSYOP GP, became a key asset. When the PDF did not surrender after initial appeals, the message changed, with the tactical commander warning that resistance was hopeless in the face of overwhelming firepower, and a series of demonstrations took place, escalating from small arms to 105 mm howitzer rounds. Subsequent broadcasts convinced the PDF to give up. The entire process allowed Ft. Amador to be secured with few casualties and minimal damage. 26. The 1991 Gulf War. Psychological operations was extremely valuable during the Gulf War due to the Iraqi military's desire to avoid combat. Through leaflets and loudspeaker broadcasts, PSYOP forces walked many enemy soldiers through successful surrender. Coalition forces worked extensively with Saudi, Kuwaiti, and other partners, to be sure psychological operations were culturally and linguistically appropriate. 27. One unusual technique involved dropping leaflets telling Iraqi troops that they would be bombed the next day by B-52 bombers, and urged them to surrender and save their lives. After the bombing the next day, which was not done in a manner to maximize casualties, another set of leaflets were dropped, saying the promise was kept and the survivors should surrender to save themselves. Variants of this technique were used on other units, telling them the specific unit that had been bombed the previous day, by the number of prisoners who surrendered, presenting the leaflet that identified itself as a safe conduct pass. This program was effective. Bosnia-Herzegovina. Following the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995, active-duty PSYOP units reinforced with U.S. Army Reserve personnel deployed to Bosnia in support of NATO Peace Implementation Forces, I-4. Elements of the 6th PSYOP Battalion served as the headquarters, Coalition Joint I-4 Information Campaign, I-4GIC, at Sarajevo, initially operating out of the former Zetra Olympic Stadium. Security at Sarajevo was provided by British, French, Italian and Turkish conventional military forces, who had been operating there under United Nations control until NATO initiated operations. Elements of the 3rd PSYOP Battalion also deployed to Sarajevo and conducted print, radio and television product development. Elements of the 9th PSYOP Battalion deployed to Tuzla in direct support of the 1st Armored Division conducting media dissemination by radio and handbill. 28. The initial mission was to provide information to military and civilians of all three warring factions, Croat, Bosniak and Serb, helping to restore a peaceful environment with the ultimate goal of saving lives and reducing tensions. The primary means of information dissemination was through radio and television as well as considerable handbill, poster and souvenir distributions such as soccer balls and coloring books. At the start of the mission, PSYOP forces in Sarajevo often came under sniper fire. Although several 6th PSYOP Battalion Humvee vehicles were damaged by gunfire, no casualties were sustained. Gunfire incidents largely subsided within the first 90 days of the mission. 28. As the mission continued to develop, PSYOP forces assumed new information support missions focused on educating the civilian population to the considerable danger of landmines and unexploded ordnance littering the countryside. A reporting system was developed for the civilian population similar to 911 in the United States, with the ultimately successful goal of encouraging civilians to report the presence of landmines and unexploded ordnance for safe removal and destruction. The threat was so significant and the civilian casualty rate so alarming that this mission became the major focus. Support was sought and achieved from DC Comics, who produced special editions of Superman comics printed in the Croatian and Serbian dialects, with equal editions printed in Latinic and Cyrillic alphabets for appropriate audiences. German organizations also contributed with print editions of a children's magazine developed in Germany specifically for this mission called Mirko, a play on the Serbo-Croatian word mir, meaning peace. 28. By summer of 1996, most PSYOP missions in Bosnia were being assumed by reserve PSYOP forces. Operation Observant Compass OOC, was a United States Department of Defense operation initially focused on apprehending Joseph Kony and ending the Lord's Resistance Army in Central Africa. It was overseen by United States Africa Command. NBC News wrote in March 2017 that the area of operations is the size of California, with about 80 military personnel and several dozen support personnel tasked with finding around 150 fighters with Kony's Lord's Resistance Army, operating across portions of 4 countries in some of the world's most inaccessible terrain. 29. Two members of OOC, Mick Mulroy and Eric Ehrick, made a documentary about a child soldier who escaped from the LRA and went on to help end it. Called My Star in the Sky. 30/31/32/33, Foreign Policy reports that Mulroy, a retired CIA officer and former Deputy Secretary of Defense, called OOC a model for how to address child soldiers using influence operations instead of lethal force. The U.S. military worked with NGOs who found mothers of child soldiers and had them broadcast messages over the radio, begging them to come home. He continued that other missions are driven by the kinetics. This was not. Marine Corps Call. John Darenduke, who previously commanded OOC, said they did everything they could to get the child soldiers to defect so they would not have to fight them by using psychological operations to appeal to them to lay down their arms, he said at one screening. 34. Mulroy said that he hopes that OOC serves as a model for future programs to address child soldiers, as well as other operations, as it showed how the U.S. military can use soft power, influence operations and other aspects of so-called irregular warfare to fight the problem. 35. Controversies. CNN and NPR interns incident in 2000. It came to light that soldiers from the 4th Psychological Operations Group had been interning at the American News Network's Cable News Network, CNN, and National Public Radio, NPR, during the late 1990s. The program was an attempt to provide its PSYOP personnel with the expertise developed by the private sector under its Training with Industry program. The program caused concern about the influence these soldiers might have on American news, and the programs were terminated. National Public Radio reported on April 10, 2000. The U.S. Army Psychological Operations Unit placed interns at CNN and NPR in 1998 and 1999. The placements at CNN were reported in the European press in February of this year and the program was terminated. The NPR placements will be reported this week in TV Guide. 36. Toppling of Saddam Hussein statue. Arguably the most visible image of the 2003 invasion of Iraq was the toppling of a statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square, central Baghdad. Allegations that the event was staged have been published. It is claimed it was actually an idea hatched by an Army Psychological Operations team. 37. Allegations surfaced that not only were the cheering group of people surrounding the statue in fact smaller than they were made out to be in media depictions, but that also the group were not local to the area and were instead brought in by the military for the specific purpose of watching and lending credence to the pre-planned toppling. 38-39. Use of music in the interrogation of prisoners. Main article, Music in Psychological Operations, PSYOP pamphlet disseminated in Iraq. The text translates as "This is your future al-Zarqa'i," and depicts al-Qaeda terrorist al-Zarqa'i caught in a rat trap which is being held by an Iraqi army soldier or an Iraqi policeman. In 2003, Sergeant Mark Hatzel claimed to have used loud music during the interrogation of Iraqi prisoners. 40. These people haven't heard heavy metal, they can't take it. If you play it for 24 hours, your brain and body functions start to slide, your train of thought slows down and your will is broken. That's when we come in and talk to them. 40. Other reports of the use of music during interrogation have occasionally plagued PSYOP. 41. On December 9, 2008, the Associated Press reported that various musicians were coordinating their objections to the use of their music as a technique for softening up captives through an initiative called 0 Decibels. 42-43. However, not all musicians have taken issue with the possibility that their music is being used during interrogations. Stevie Benton of the group Drowning Pool commented supportively. 43. I take it as an honor to think that perhaps our song could be used to quell another 9/11 attack or something like that. 43. Afghanistan burning bodies incident. On October 1, 2005 in Gumwad, Afghanistan, soldiers from the 173rd Airborne decided to burn the bodies of 2 Taliban fighters killed in a firefight the previous day for hygienic reasons. Despite Islamic customs that forbid cremation, they chose to proceed. The platoon leader also failed to properly notify his battalion commander of the decision prior to burning the bodies. When his battalion commander was notified, he ordered the flaming bodies to be extinguished. An official investigation into the incident found evidence of poor decision-making, poor judgment, poor reporting, a lack of knowledge and respect for local Afghan custom and tradition. The infantry officer received a general officer letter of reprimand. Reserve PSYOP soldiers were involved because they heard about the incident and used the information to incite Taliban fighters in another area where freelance journalist Stephen DuPont was located. DuPont reported that the PSYOP soldiers claimed the bodies were to be burned due to hygiene concerns. 44. During the War on Terror, U.S. PSYOP teams often broadcast abrasive messages over loudspeakers to try to tempt enemy fighters into direct confrontation, where the Americans have the upper hand. Other times, they use their loudspeaker to convince enemy soldiers to surrender. In the Afghanistan incident, a PSYOP sergeant allegedly broadcast the following message to the Taliban. Attention, Taliban, you are all cowardly dogs. You allowed your fighters to be laid down facing west and burned. You are too scared to retrieve their bodies. This just proves you are the lady boys we always believed you to be, another soldier stated. You attack and run away like women. You call yourself Talibs, but you are a disgrace to the Muslim religion and you bring shame upon your family. Come and fight like men instead of the cowardly dogs you are. U.S. authorities investigated the incident and the 2 reserve PSYOP soldiers received administrative punishment for broadcasting messages which were not approved. Investigators found no evidence that the bodies were burned for a psychological effect. They concluded that the broadcast violated standing policies for the content of loudspeaker messages and urged that all soldiers in the command undergo training on Afghan sensitivities. 45. Pentagon analysts and the mainstream media in 2008, The New York Times exposed how analysts portrayed in the U.S. news media as independent and objective were in fact under the tutelage of the Pentagon. 46. According to the NET. Hidden behind that appearance of objectivity, though, is a Pentagon information apparatus that has used those analysts in a campaign to generate favorable news coverage of the administration's wartime performance. 2009 Congressional Delegation to Afghanistan. In February 2011, journalist Michael Hastings reported in Rolling Stone that Lieutenant Colonel Michael Holmes, the supposed leader of a PSYOP group in Afghanistan, alleged that Lieutenant Gen. William B. Caldwell, a three-star general in charge of training troops in Afghanistan, 47, ordered Holmes and his group to perform in-depth research on visiting U.S. congressmen in order to spend presentations and visits. 48, according to Holmes, his team was tasked with illegally providing themes and messages to influence the people and leadership of the United States. 49, reported targets included United States Senators John McCain, Joe Lieberman, Jack Reed, Al Franken, Carl Levin, Rep. Steve Israel of the House Appropriations Committee, ATM, Mike Mullen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Czech ambassador to Afghanistan, the German Interior Minister, and think tank analysts. 48. Under the 1948 Smith-Mundt Act, such operations may not be used to target Americans. When Holmes attempted to seek counsel and to protest, he was placed under investigation by the military at the behest of General Caldwell's Chief of Staff. 48. Caldwell's spokesman, Lieutenant Col. Sean Stroud, denied Holmes's assertions, and other unnamed military officials disputed Holmes's claims as false and misleading, saying there are no records of him ever completing any PSYOP training. Subsequently, Holmes conceded that he was not a psychological operations officer nor was he in charge of a psychological operations unit and acknowledged that Caldwell's orders were fairly innocuous. 50. Officials say that Holmes spent his time in theater starting a strategic communications business with Major Laurel Levine, with whom he conducted an improper relationship in Afghanistan. A former aide said, "At no point did Holmes ever provide a product to Gen. Caldwell." General David Petraeus has since ordered an investigation into the alleged incident. 49. Portrayals in popular culture. The General's Daughter. From both the novel and blockbuster movie, The General's Daughter was a PSYOP officer. A Use Kapok combat patch, FWSSSI, can be seen being worn by a soldier in the film X-Men, The Last Stand in the President's Command Center. The book The Men Who Stare at Goats and film deal extensively with PSYOP. The Use Kapok patch can be seen being worn by the characters portrayed by Spike Jonze, Ice Cube, and Mark Wahlberg in the movie Three Kings. The novel Tree of Smoke by writer Dennis Johnson revolves around PSYOP. In the 9th season of the television series NSYS, Jamie Lee Curtis plays a recurring role as the civilian PSYOPs director at the U.S. Department of Defense. In the 1979 film Apocalypse Now, during the famous helicopter attack on the beach, actor Robert Duvall, playing LTC Bill Kilgore, says over the radio, "Put on PSYWAR, make it loud. Shall we dance?" At which point the helicopter-mounted loudspeakers start playing Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. In the 1959 Korean War film Porkchop Hill, the Chinese continuously broadcast propaganda over loudspeakers between battles. In the 2012 film Safe House, former CIA agent Tobin Frost, with excellent psychological warfare expertise. In the 2016 film The Accountant, the father of the main character is a PSYOP colonel. See also Chuhoi CIA's Special Activities Division, Congress for Cultural Freedom, Disinformation, Fake News, Information Warfare, Lockheed DC 130, Operation Mockingbird, Pentagon Military Analyst Program, Propaganda, Psychological Warfare Division. Disinformation is false information spread deliberately to deceive. 1, 2, 3. This is a subset of misinformation, which also may be unintentional. The English word disinformation is a loan translation of the Russian dezinformatsiya, 123, derived from the title of a KGB black propaganda department. 4. Joseph Stalin coined the term, giving it a French-sounding name to claim it had a Western origin. 1. Russian news began with a special disinformation office in 1923. 5. Disinformation was defined in Great Soviet Encyclopedia, 1952, as false information with the intention to deceive public opinion. 126. Operation Infection was a Soviet disinformation campaign to influence opinion that the U.S. invented AIDS. 167. The U.S. did not actively counter disinformation until 1980, when a fake document reported that the U.S. supported apartheid. 8. The word disinformation did not appear in English dictionaries until the late 1980s. 1-2. English use increased in 1986, after revelations that the Reagan administration engaged in disinformation against Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. 9. By 1990 it was pervasive in U.S. politics. 10. And by 2001 referred generally to lying and propaganda.
Sources online also claim that AIDS was developed at Fort Detrick, basically. So you can Google that. And some sources claim that they have a top secret program. They have programs, projects and operations. Project Teardrop is supposedly the plan to reduce global population to 500 million. So it can also be a global psychological operation. And synthetic telepathy has been around since 1974. I've covered these things more extensively in previous broadcasts on my channel Try Something.Vegetarian. And I've also made a broadcast about the top 10 mainstream media blackout subjects. When we're talking about fake news. Trump called CNN fake news. Of course, Project Mockingbird is known. So they have several projects, programs and operations. And the US taxpayers know about these things because the government has to report to the citizens what they have spent their tax money on. So many of these projects, programs and operations are declassified. You're down with LPP? I think that's something else.
Fake news, also known as junk news, pseudo-news, or hoax news 1-2, is a type of yellow journalism or propaganda that consists of deliberate disinformation or hoaxes spread via traditional news media, print and broadcast, or online social media. 3-4. The false information is often caused by reporters paying sources for stories, an unethical practice called checkbook journalism. Digital news has brought back and increased the usage of fake news, or yellow journalism. 5. The news is then often reverberated as misinformation in social media but occasionally finds its way to the mainstream media as well. Fake news is written and published usually with the intent to mislead in order to damage an agency, entity, or person, and or gain financially or politically. 7-8-9, often using sensationalist, dishonest, or outright fabricated headlines to increase readership. Similarly, clickbait stories and headlines earn advertising revenue from this activity. 7. The relevance of fake news has increased in post-truth politics. For media outlets, the ability to attract viewers to their websites is necessary to generate online advertising revenue. Publishing a story with false content that attracts users benefits advertisers and improves ratings. Easy access to online advertisement revenue, increased political polarization and the popularity of social media, primarily the Facebook news feed. 3. have all been implicated in the spread of fake news. 710, which competes with legitimate news stories. Hostile government actors have also been implicated in generating and propagating fake news, particularly during elections. 1112, Facebook logo, blue letters on white background, confirmation bias, and social media algorithms like those used on Facebook and Twitter further advance the spread of fake news. Modern impact is felt, for example, in vaccine hesitancy. 13. Fake news undermines serious media coverage and makes it more difficult for journalists to cover significant news stories. 14. An analysis by BuzzFeed found that the top 20 fake news stories about the 2016 U.S. presidential election received more engagement on Facebook than the top 20 election stories from 19 major media outlets. 15. Anonymously hosted fake news websites. 3. Lacking known publishers have also been criticized, because they make it difficult to prosecute sources of fake news for libel. 16. The term is also at times used to cast doubt upon legitimate news from an opposing political standpoint, a tactic known as the lying press. 1718. During and after his presidential campaign and election, Donald Trump popularized the term fake news in this sense when he used it to describe the negative press coverage of himself. 1920, in part, as a result of Trump's use of the term has come under increasing criticism, and in October 2018 the British government decided that it will no longer use the term because it is a poorly defined and misleading term that conflates a variety of false information, from genuine error through to foreign interference in democratic processes. Wiki/fake_news. Wiki, disinformation. Wiki/psychological_operations_united_states #black_psyop. Propaganda is information that is used primarily to influence an audience and further an agenda, which may not be objective and may be presenting facts selectively to encourage a particular synthesis or perception, or using loaded language to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information that is presented. 2. Propaganda is often associated with material prepared by governments, but activist groups, companies, religious organizations, the media, and individuals can also produce propaganda. In the 20th century, the term propaganda had often been associated with a manipulative approach, but propaganda historically is a neutral descriptive term. 2-3. A wide range of materials and media are used for conveying propaganda messages, which changed as new technologies were invented, including paintings, cartoons, posters, pamphlets, films, radio shows, TV shows, and websites. More recently, the digital age has given rise to new ways of disseminating propaganda, for example, through the use of bots and algorithms to create computational propaganda and spread fake or biased news using social media. In a 1929 literary debate with Edward Bernays, Everett Dean Martin argues that propaganda is making puppets of us. We are moved by hidden strings which the propagandist manipulates. During the Bosnian War, 1992-95, Serbian Večernje Novosti published a war report supposedly from Bosnia titled, Painful Reminder, and illustrated with a well-known Eros Perdix painting from 1888, right, presented as an actual photograph from the scene, left, of, as stated in report below image, a Serbian boy whose whole family was killed by Bosnian Muslims. Perdix's original painting is titled Siros na Majdanom Grabu, Orphan at Mother's Grave. 1. Psychological Operations United States description. Psychological operations are operations to convey selected information and indicators to audiences to influence their emotions, motives, and objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. Wikipedia identification symbol, Army, Knight, Chess, Colors, Army, bottle green piped with silver gray patron, St. Gabriel, Army, Garrison/HQ, Army, Fort Bragg, NC, Marine, Quantico, VA, Air Force, Middletown, PA, Navy, Norfolk, VA. Psychological warfare, PSYWAR, or the basic aspects of modern psychological operations, PSYOP, have been known by many other names or terms, including MISO, PSYOPS, political warfare, hearts and minds, and propaganda. 1. The term is used to denote any action which is practiced mainly by psychological methods with the aim of evoking a planned psychological reaction in other people. 2. Various techniques are used, and are aimed at influencing a target audience's value system, belief system, emotions, motives, reasoning, or behavior. It is used to induce confessions or reinforce attitudes and behaviors favorable to the originator's objectives, and are sometimes combined with black operations or false flag tactics. It is also used to destroy the morale of enemies through tactics that aim to depress troops' psychological states. 3-4. Target audiences can be governments, organizations, groups, and individuals, and is not just limited to soldiers. Civilians of foreign territories can also be targeted by technology and media so as to cause an effect in the government of their country. 5. In propaganda, the formation of men's attitudes, Jacques Ellul discusses psychological warfare as a common peace policy practice between nations as a form of indirect aggression. This type of propaganda drains the public opinion of an opposing regime by stripping away its power on public opinion. This form of aggression is hard to defend against because no international court of justice is capable of protecting against psychological aggression since it cannot be legally adjudicated. Here the propagandist is sick, dealing with a foreign adversary whose morale he seeks to destroy by psychological means so that the opponent begins to doubt the validity of his beliefs and actions. 6-7. There is evidence of psychological warfare throughout written history. In modern times, psychological warfare efforts have been used extensively. Mass communication allows for direct communication with an enemy populace, and therefore has been used in many efforts. In recent times, the Internet allows for campaigns of disinformation and misinformation performed by agents anywhere in the world. History. Early mosaic of Alexander the Great on his campaign against the Persian Empire. Since prehistoric times, warlords and chiefs have recognized the importance of weakening morale of opponents. In the Battle of Pelusium, 525 BC, between the Persian Empire and ancient Egypt, the Persian forces used cats and other animals as a psychological tactic against the Egyptians, who avoided harming cats due to religious belief and spells. Currying favor with supporters was the other side of psychological warfare, and an early practitioner of such this was Alexander the Great, who successfully conquered large parts of Europe and the Middle East and held on to his territorial gains by co-opting local elites into the Greek administration and culture. Alexander left some of his men behind in each conquered city to introduce Greek culture and oppress dissident views. His soldiers were paid dowries to marry locals. 8. In an effort to encourage assimilation, Genghis Khan, leader of the Mongolian Empire in the 13th century, had employed less subtle techniques. Defeating the will of the enemy before having to attack and reaching a consented settlement was preferable to facing his wrath. The Mongol generals demanded submission to the Khan, and threatened the initially captured villages with complete destruction if they refused to surrender. If they had to fight to take the settlement, the Mongol generals fulfilled their threats and massacred the survivors. Tales of the encroaching horde spread to the next villages and created an aura of insecurity that undermined the possibility of future resistance. 9. The Khan also employed tactics that made his numbers seem greater than they actually were. During night operations, he ordered each soldier to light 3 torches at dusk to give the illusion of an overwhelming army and deceive and intimidate enemy scouts. He also sometimes had objects tied to the tails of his horses, so that riding on open and dry fields raised a cloud of dust that gave the enemy the impression of great numbers. His soldiers used arrows specially notched to whistle as they flew through the air, creating a terrifying noise. 10. Another tactic favored by the Mongols was catapulting severed human heads over city walls to frighten the inhabitants and spread disease in the besieged city's closed confines. This was especially used by the later Turco-Mongol chieftain, the Muslim Caliph Omar, in his battles against the Byzantine Empire, sent small reinforcements in the form of a continuous stream, giving the impression that a large force would accumulate eventually if not swiftly dealt with. During the early Qin dynasty and late Eastern Zhou dynasty in 1st century of China, the empty fort strategy was used to trick the enemy into believing that an empty location was an ambush, in order to prevent them from attacking it using reverse psychology. This tactic also relied on luck, should the enemy believe that the location is a threat to them. In the 6th century BCE, Greek Bias of Priene successfully resisted the Lydian king Auletes by fattening up a pair of mules and driving them out of the besieged city. 11. When Auletes' envoy was then sent to Priene, Bias had piles of sand covered with corn to give the impression of plentiful resources. This ruse appears to have been well known in medieval Europe. Defenders in castles or towns under siege would throw food from the walls to show besiegers that provisions were plentiful. A famous example occurs in the 8th century legend of Lady Carcass, who supposedly persuaded the Franks to abandon a 5-year siege by this means and gave her name to Carcassonne as a result. Modern World War I. Lord Bryce led the Commission of 1915 to document German atrocities committed against Belgian civilians. The start of modern psychological operations in war is generally dated to the World War I. By that point, Western societies were increasingly educated and urbanized, and mass media was available in the form of large circulation newspapers and posters. It was also possible to transmit propaganda to the enemy via the use of airborne leaflets or through explosive delivery systems like modified artillery or mortar rounds. 12. At the start of the war, the belligerents, especially the British and Germans, began distributing propaganda, both domestically and on the Western Front. The British had several advantages that allowed them to succeed in the battle for world opinion. They had one of the world's most reputable news systems, with much experience in international and cross-cultural communication, and they controlled much of the undersea cable system then in operation. These capabilities were easily transitioned to the task of warfare. The British also had a diplomatic service that maintained good relations with many nations around the world, in contrast to the reputation of the German services. 13. While German attempts to foment revolution in parts of the British Empire, such as Ireland and India, were ineffective, extensive experience in the Middle East allowed the British to successfully induce the Arabs to revolt against the Ottoman Empire. In August 1914, David Lloyd George appointed Charles Masterman MP, to head a propaganda agency at Wellington House. A distinguished body of literary talent was enlisted for the task, with its members including Arthur Conan Doyle, Ford Madox Ford, G. K. Chesterton, Thomas Hardy, Rudyard Kipling and H. G. Wells. Over 1,160 pamphlets were published during the war and distributed to neutral countries, and eventually, to Germany. One of the first significant publications, the Report on Alleged German Outrages of 1915, had a great effect on general opinion across the world. The pamphlet documented atrocities, both actual and alleged, committed by the German army against Belgian civilians. A Dutch illustrator, Louis Reemekers, provided the highly emotional drawings which appeared in the pamphlet. 14. In 1917, the Bureau was subsumed into the new Department of Information and branched out into telegraph communications, radio, newspapers, magazines and the cinema. In 1918, Viscount Northcliffe was appointed Director of Propaganda in enemy countries. The department was split between propaganda against Germany organized by H. G. Wells, and propaganda against the Austro-Hungarian Empire supervised by Wickham Steed and Robert William Seton Watson. The attempts of the latter focused on the lack of ethnic cohesion in the empire and stoked the grievances of minorities such as the Croats and Slovenes. It had a significant effect on the final collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. 12. Aerial leaflets were dropped over German trenches containing postcards from prisoners of war detailing their humane conditions, surrender notices and general propaganda against the Kaiser and the German generals. By the end of the war, MI7B had distributed almost 26 million leaflets. The Germans began shooting the leaflet-dropping pilots, prompting the British to develop unmanned leaflet balloons that drifted across no man's land. At least 1 in 7 of these leaflets were not handed in by the soldiers to their superiors, despite severe penalties for that offense. Even General Hindenburg admitted that unsuspectingly, many thousands consumed the poison, and Pals admitted to being disillusioned by the propaganda leaflets that depicted the use of German troops as mere cannon fodder. In 1915, the British began airdropping a regular leaflet newspaper Le Courrier de l'Air for civilians in German-occupied France and Belgium. 15. At the start of the war, the French government took control of the media to suppress negative coverage. Only in 1916, with the establishment of the Maison de la Presse, did they begin to use similar tactics for the purpose of psychological warfare. One of its sections was the Service de la Propagande Aérienne, Aerial Propaganda Service, headed by Professor Tunnelat and Jean-Jacques Waltz, an Alsatian artist codenamed Hansi. The French tended to distribute leaflets of images only, although the full publication of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which had been heavily edited in the German newspapers, was distributed via airborne leaflets by the French. 16. The Central Powers were slow to use these techniques. However, at the start of the war the Germans succeeded in inducing the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to declare holy war, or jihad, against the Western infidels. They also attempted to foment rebellion against the British Empire in places as far afield as Ireland, Afghanistan, and India. The Germans' greatest success was in giving the Russian revolutionary, Lenin, free transit on a seal train from Switzerland to Finland after the overthrow of the Tsar. This soon paid off when the Bolshevik Revolution took Russia out of the war. 17. World War II. An example of a World War II aerial leaflet meant to be dropped from an American B-17 over a German city. See the file description page for a translation. Adolf Hitler was greatly influenced by the psychological tactics of warfare the British had employed during WWI, and attributed the defeat of Germany to the effects this propaganda had on the soldiers. He became committed to the use of mass propaganda to influence the minds of the German population in the decades to come. By calling his movement the Third Reich, he was able to convince many civilians that his cause was not just a fad, but the way of their future. Joseph Goebbels was appointed as propaganda minister when Hitler came to power in 1933, and he portrayed Hitler as a messianic figure for the redemption of Germany. Hitler also coupled this with the resonating projections of his rations for effect. Germany's Fall-Grun plan of invasion of Czechoslovakia had a large part dealing with psychological warfare aimed both at the Czechoslovak civilians and government as well as, crucially, at Czechoslovak allies. 18. It became successful to the point that Germany gained support of UK and France through appeasement to occupy Czechoslovakia without having to fight an all-out war, sustaining only minimum losses in covert war before the Munich Agreement. At the start of the Second World War, the British set up the Political Warfare Executive to produce and distribute propaganda. Through the use of powerful transmitters, broadcasts could be made across Europe. Sefton Delmer managed a successful black propaganda campaign through several radio stations which were designed to be popular with German troops while at the same time introducing news material that would weaken their morale under a veneer of authenticity. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill made use of radio broadcasts for propaganda against the Germans, map depicting the targets of all the subordinate plans of Operation Bodyguard. During World War II, the British made extensive use of deception, developing many new techniques and theories. The main protagonists at this time were a force, set up in 1940 under Dudley Clarke, and the London Controlling Section, chartered in 1942 under the control of John Bevan. 1920, Clarke pioneered many of the strategies of military deception. His ideas for combining fictional orders of battle, visual deception and double agents helped define Allied deception strategy during the war, for which he has been referred to as the greatest British deceiver of WW2. 21. During the lead-up to the Allied invasion of Normandy, many new tactics in psychological warfare were devised. The plan for Operation Bodyguard set out a general strategy to mislead German high command as to the exact date and location of the invasion. Planning began in 1943 under the auspices of the London Controlling Section, LCS. A draft strategy, referred to as Plan Jail, was presented to Allied High Command at the Tehran Conference. Operation Fortitude was intended to convince the Germans of a greater Allied military strength than existed, through fictional field armies, faked operations to prepare the ground for invasion and leaked information about the Allied order of battle and war plans. Elaborate naval deceptions, Operations Glimmer, Taxable and Big Drum, were undertaken in the English Channel. 22. Small ships and aircraft simulated invasion fleets lying off Pas-de-Calais, Cap d'Antifer in the western flank of the real invasion force. 23. At the same time Operation Titanic involved the RAF dropping fake paratroopers to the east and west of the Normandy landings, a dummy Sherman tank, used to deceive the Germans. The deceptions were implemented with the use of double agents, radio traffic and visual deception. The British double-cross anti-espionage operation had proven very successful from the outset of the war. 24. And the LCS was able to use double agents to send back misleading information about Allied invasion plans. 25. The use of visual deception, including mock tanks and other military hardware, had been developed during the North Africa campaign. Mock hardware was created for Bodyguard. In particular, dummy landing craft were stockpiled to give the impression that the invasion would take place near Calais. The operation was a strategic success and the Normandy landings caught German defenses unaware. Subsequent deception led Hitler into delaying reinforcement from the Calais region for nearly 7 weeks. 26. Vietnam War, Viet Cong, beware. South Vietnam leaflets urging the defection of Viet Cong. The United States ran an extensive program of psychological warfare during the Vietnam War. The Phoenix program had the dual aim of assassinating National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, NLF or Viet Cong, personnel and terrorizing any potential sympathizers or passive supporters. The Chu Hoi program of the South Vietnam government promoted NLF defections. When members of the PRG were assassinated, CIA and Special Forces operatives placed playing cards in the mouth of the deceased as a calling card. During the Phoenix program, over 19,000 NLF supporters were killed. 27. The United States also used tapes of distorted human sounds and played them during the night, making the Vietnamese soldiers think that the dead were back for revenge. Recent operations. An American PSYOP leaflet disseminated during the Iraq War. It shows a caricature of al-Qaeda and Iraq leader Abu Musbal Zarqawi caught in a rat trap. The caption reads, "This is your future, Zarqawi." The CIA made extensive use of Contra soldiers to destabilize the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. 28. The CIA used psychological warfare techniques against the Panamanians by delivering unlicensed TV broadcasts. The United States government has used propaganda broadcasts against the Cuban government through TV Marti, based in Miami, Florida. However, the Cuban government has been successful at jamming the signal of TV Marti. In the Iraq War, the United States used the shock and awe campaign to psychologically maim and break the will of the Iraqi army to fight. In cyberspace, social media has enabled the use of disinformation on a wide scale. Analysts have found evidence of doctored or misleading photographs spread by social media in the Syrian civil war and 2014 Russian military intervention in Ukraine. possibly with state involvement. 29. Military and governments have engaged in psychological operations, PSYOPs, and informational warfare on social networking platforms to regulate foreign propaganda, which includes countries like the US, Russia, and China. 3031. Methods. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. Find sources: Psychological Warfare, News Newspapers Books Scholar Ster, February 2011. Learn how and when to remove this template message. Most modern uses of the term psychological warfare refers to the following military methods: demoralization, distributing pamphlets that encourage desertion or supply instructions on how to surrender; shock and awe military strategy, projecting repetitive and annoying sounds and music for long periods at high volume towards groups under siege, like during Operation Nifty; package tolerance, indoctrination, so that the totems and culture of a defeated enemy can be removed or replaced without conflict. Propaganda radio stations, such as Lord Haw Haw in World War II on the Germany calling station, renaming cities and other places when captured, such as the renaming of Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City after communist victory in the Vietnam War. False flag events, use of loudspeaker systems to communicate with enemy soldiers. Terrorism. 32. The threat of chemical weapons. 33. Information warfare. 34. Most of these techniques were developed during World War II or earlier, and have been used to some degree in every conflict since. Daniel Lerner was in the OSS, the predecessor to the American CIA, and in his book, Attempts to Analyze How Effective the Various Strategies Were, he concludes that there is little evidence that any of them were dramatically successful, except perhaps surrender instructions over loudspeakers when victory was imminent. Measuring the success or failure of psychological warfare is very hard, as the conditions are very far from being a controlled experiment. Lerner also divides psychological warfare operations into 3 categories. 35 page needed. White propaganda, omissions and emphasis, truthful and not strongly biased, where the source of information is acknowledged.
Yuri Besmanev did an interesting broadcast about active measures, ideological subversion, activity merpriachnia or something in Russian. So we should use reversed active measures, stabilization, humanization, generating an economic surge, and demilitarization is phase 4. The opposite of normalization is when the tanks roll in.
Gray propaganda, omissions, emphasis and racial/ethnic/religious bias. Largely truthful, containing no information that can be proven wrong, the source is not identified. Black propaganda, commissions of falsification, inherently deceitful, information given in the product is attributed to a source that was not responsible for its creation. Lerner points out that gray and black operations ultimately have a heavy cost, in that the target population sooner or later recognizes them as propaganda and discredits the source. He writes, "This is one of the few dogmas advanced by sick warriors that is likely to endure as an axiom of propaganda. Credibility is a condition of persuasion. Before you can make a man do as you say, you must make him believe what you say." 35:28. Consistent with this idea, the Allied strategy in World War II was predominantly one of truth, with certain exceptions. Citation needed. By country: Soviet Union main articles, Zersatsung, Russian military deception, and active measures. China. According to U.S. military analysts, attacking the enemy's mind is an important element of the People's Republic of China's military strategy. 36. This type of warfare is rooted in the Chinese stratagems outlined by Sun Tzu in The Art of War and 36 stratagems. In its dealings with its rivals, China is expected to utilize Marxism to mobilize communist loyalists, as well as flex its economic and military muscle to persuade other nations to act in China's interests. The Chinese government also tries to control the media to keep a tight hold on propaganda efforts for its people. 36. Germany. In the German Bundeswehr, The Zentrum Operative Information and its subordinate Battalion for Operative Information 950 are responsible for the PSYOP efforts, called Operative Information in German. Both the center and the battalion are subordinate to the new Streitkräftebasis, Joint Services Support Command, SKB, and together consist of about 1,200 soldiers specializing in modern communication and media technologies. One project of the German PSYOP forces is the radio station Stimme der Freiheit, Sauti Azadi, Voice of Freedom, 37, heard by thousands of Afghans. Another is the publication of various newspapers and magazines in Kosovo and Afghanistan, where German soldiers serve with NATO. United Kingdom. The British were one of the first major military powers to use psychological warfare in the First and Second World Wars. In the current British Armed Forces, PSYOPs are handled by the Tri-Service 15 Psychological Operations Group, see also MI5 and Secret Intelligence Service. The Psychological Operations Group comprises over 150 personnel, approximately 75 from the regular armed services and 75 from the reserves. The group supports deployed commanders in the provision of psychological operations in operational and tactical environments. 38-39. The group was established immediately after the 1991 Gulf War. 40. Has since grown significantly in size to meet operational requirements. 41, and from 2015 it will be one of the subunits of the 77th Brigade, formerly called the Security Assistance Group. 42, Stephen Jolly, the MOD's Director of Defence Communications and former chair of the UK's National Security Communications Committee, 2013-15, is thought to be the most senior serving PSYOPs officer within British defence. In June 2015, NSA files published by Glenn Greenwald revealed details of the JTRG group at British intelligence agency GCHQ covertly manipulating online communities. 43. This is in line with JTRG's goal, to destroy, deny, degrade, and disrupt enemies by discrediting them, planting misinformation and shutting down their communications. 44. In March 2019, it emerged that the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, DSTL, of the UK's Ministry of Defence, MOD, is tendering to arms companies and universities for £70 million worth of assistance under a project to develop new methods of psychological warfare. The project is known as the Human and Social Sciences Research Capability, HSSRC. 45. United States. See also, Psychological Operations, United States. U.S. Army soldier hands out a newspaper to a local in Mosul, Iraq. U.S. Army loudspeaker team in action in Korea. The term psychological warfare is believed to have migrated from Germany to the United States in 1941. 46. During World War II, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff defined psychological warfare broadly, stating psychological warfare employs any weapon to influence the mind of the enemy. The weapons are psychological only in the effect they produce and not because of the weapons themselves. 47. The U.S. Department of Defense currently defines psychological warfare as the planned use of propaganda and other psychological actions having the primary purpose of influencing the opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of hostile foreign groups in such a way as to support the achievement of national objectives. 48. This definition indicates that a critical element of the U.S. psychological operations capabilities includes propaganda and by extension counter-propaganda. Joint Publication 353 establishes specific policy to use public affairs mediums to counter propaganda from foreign origins. 49. The purpose of United States psychological operations is to induce or reinforce attitudes and behaviors favorable to U.S. objectives. The Special Activities Division, SAD, is a division of the Central Intelligence Agency's National Clandestine Service, responsible for covert action and special activities. These special activities include covert political influence, which includes psychological operations, and paramilitary operations. 50. SAD's Political Influence Group is the only U.S. unit allowed to conduct these operations covertly and is considered the primary unit in this area. 50. Dedicated psychological operations units exist in the United States Army, The United States Navy also plans and executes limited PSYOP missions. United States PSYOP units and soldiers of all branches of the military are prohibited by law from targeting U.S. citizens with PSYOP within the borders of the United States. Executive Order S-1233, DoD Directive S-3321.1, and National Security Decision Directive 130. While United States Army PSYOP units may offer non-PSYOP support to domestic military missions, they can only target foreign audiences. A U.S. Army Field Manual released in January 2013 states that inform and influence activities are critical for describing, directing, and leading military operations. Several Army Division leadership staff are assigned to planning, integration and synchronization of designated information-related capabilities. 51. United States PSYOP units and soldiers of all branches of the military are prohibited by law from targeting U.S. citizens with PSYOP within the borders of the United States. See also Psychology Portal War Portal Charles Douglas Jackson Demonizing the Enemy Demoralization, Warfare, Directed Energy Weapon Information Warfare Lawfare Media Manipulation Military Psychology Mind Games Minor Sabotage Political Warfare Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes Psychological Manipulation Special Operations Taliban Propaganda Unconventional Warfare Fear Section Manipulation NATO, Able Archer 83 UK, Briggs Plan US Specific. Information Operations Roadmap Military Journalism NLF and PAVN Battle Tactics Psychological Operations, United States, Special Activities Division Zarqati PSYOP Program World War II. Political Warfare Executive Psychological Warfare Division USSR, Active Measures Related. Asymmetric Warfare 4th Generation Warfare. A Directed Energy Weapon, DEW, is a ranged weapon that damages its target with highly focused energy, including laser, microwaves and particle beams. Potential applications of this technology include weapons that target personnel, missiles, vehicles, and optical devices. 1-2, in the United States, the Pentagon, DARPA, the Air Force Research Laboratory, United States Army Armament Research Development and Engineering Center, and the Naval Research Laboratory are researching directed energy weapons and railguns to counter ballistic missiles, hypersonic cruise missiles, and hypersonic glide vehicles. These systems of missile defense are expected to come online no sooner than the mid to late 2020s. 3. Russia, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, China, 10, 11, 12, 13, India, 14, and the United Kingdom 15, 16, are also developing directed energy weapons. After decades of R&D, directed energy weapons are still at the experimental stage and it remains to be seen if or when they will be deployed as practical, high-performance military weapons.
So of course they've used directed energy weapons on thousands of targeted individuals that also have their videos on YouTube that are misled, misdirected to believe that they are microwave weapons, that it's microwave harassment, while in reality they use Tesla's wireless energy technology, and they can do attacks in pulsed energy projectile mode and active denial system mode, and that beam is partially deflected by a grounded Van de Graaff generator. More about it in my previous broadcasts. So Wiki, the CIA Vatican edited encyclopedia, is trying to suggest that they don't have them yet. Then how do they explain thousands of targeted individuals with their videos on YouTube and all over the internet?
Situation in the Middle East and the question of Third World War.
Has Wikipedia published anything about it, you ask? The possibility of a Third World War. Perhaps there are book writers that Wikipedia has covered. So, and what was the first question? World War and...
Middle East situation and the question of a possible Third World War.
Well, they have a good pacifism article, I think. And there are some good Mahatma Gandhi quotes. So then we can finally move on to the state-sponsored terrorism.
I saw the word Jesuits there in the column, but is that Wikipedia too?
I don't know where you saw that.
Well, the same screen where on the right is the picture and on the left is a column of subjects underneath each other.
Well, perhaps I already clicked it away, so...
Oh, you did, yeah.
Of course there are articles on Wikipedia about the Jesuits as well. So state sponsors of terrorism US list. I will go through that shortly. Terrorist safe havens Pakistan is listed. I won't read that with the speech engine, so let's read this part.
State sponsors of terrorism is a designation applied by the United States Department of State to countries which the department alleges to have repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism. 2-3. Inclusion on the list imposes strict unilateral sanctions. The State Department is required to maintain the list under Section 6J of the Export Administration Act, Section 40 of the Arms Export Control Act, and Section 628 of the Foreign Assistance Act. 3. The list began on December 29, 1979, with Libya, Iraq, South Yemen, and Syria. Cuba was added to the list on March 1, 1982, and Iran on January 19, 1984. Later North Korea in 1988 and Sudan on August 12, 1993, were added. South Yemen was removed from the list in 1990, Iraq was removed twice in 1982 and 2004, Libya was removed in 2006, and Cuba was removed in 2015. North Korea was removed in 2008, but was re-added to the list again in 2017. 4. Contents: 1 countries currently on the list, 1.1 Iran, 1.2 North Korea, 1.3 Sudan, 1.4 Syria, 2 countries that have been removed, 2.1 Cuba, 2.2 Iraq, 2.3 Libya, 2.4 South Yemen. Iran was added to the list on January 19, 1984, according to Country Reports on Terrorism 2013. 5.
As I've said before, this aspect of our strategy was moving too slowly, but the fall of Ramadi has galvanized the Iraqi government. So with the additional steps I ordered last month, we're speeding up training of ISIL forces. We're speeding up training of ISIL forces. We're speeding up training of ISIL forces, including volunteers from Sunni tribes in Anbar province.
The United States has at various times in recent history provided support to terrorist and paramilitary organizations around the world. It has also provided assistance to numerous authoritarian regimes that have used state terrorism as a tool of repression. 1-2. United States support for non-state terrorists has been prominent in Latin America, the Middle East, and Southern Africa. 1. From 1981 to 1991, the United States provided weapons, training, and extensive financial and logistical support to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, who used terror tactics in their fight against the Nicaraguan government. 3. At various points the United States also provided training, arms, and funds to terrorists among the Cuban exiles, such as Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carrols. Various reasons have been given to justify such support. These include destabilizing political movements that might have aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, including popular democratic and socialist movements. 4. Such support has also formed a part of the war on drugs. 2. Support was also geared toward ensuring a conducive environment for American corporate interests abroad, especially when these interests came under threat from democratic governments. 4-5. Contents: 1 Years of lead 1.1 Piazza Fontana bombing 2 Contras 2.1 Background 2.2 Covert Operations 2.3 Propaganda 2.4 International Court of Justice ruling 3 Cuban exiles 3.1 Orlando Bosch 3.2 Luis Posada Carrols 4 Colombian paramilitary groups 4.1 Plan Lazo 4.2 Armed Forces Directive No. 200/0591 4.3 Los Pips 5 Kosovo Liberation Army 6 See also 7 References 8 Sources Years of lead Main articles, Years of lead, Italy, and Terrorism in Italy since 1945 See also, Operation Gladio and Italy United States relations The Years of lead was a period of socio-political turmoil in Italy that lasted from the late 1960s into the early 1980s. This period was marked by a wave of terrorism carried out by both right and left-wing paramilitary groups. It was concluded that the former were supported by the United States as a strategy of tension. 678. General Gianni Miletti, commander of the counterintelligence section of the Italian Military Intelligence Service from 1971 to 1975, stated that his men in the region of Venice discovered a right-wing terrorist cell that had been supplied with military explosives from Germany, and alleged that U.S. intelligence services instigated and abetted right-wing terrorism in Italy during the 1970s. 9. According to the investigation of Italian Judge Guido Salvini, the neo-fascist organizations involved in the strategy of tension, La Finis, Avanguardia Nazionale, or Di Nuovo were the troops of clandestine armed forces, directed by components of the state apparatus related to the CIA. 10. Any relationship of the CIA to the terrorist attacks perpetrated in Italy during the Years of lead is the subject of debate. Switzerland and Belgium have had parliamentary inquiries into the matter. 11. Piazza Fontana bombing. Plaque in memory of the 17 victims of the terrorist bombing in Piazza Fontana Main article, Piazza Fontana bombing. The Piazza Fontana bombing was a terrorist attack that occurred on December 12, 1969 at 1637, when a bomb exploded at the headquarters of Banca Nazionale dell'Agricoltura, National Agrarian Bank, in Piazza Fontana in Milan, killing 17 people and wounding 88. The same afternoon, 3 more bombs were detonated in Rome and Milan, and another was found undetonated. 12. In 1998, Milan Judge Guido Salvini indicted U.S. Navy officer David Carrot on charges of political and military espionage for his participation in the Piazza Fontana bombing et al. Salvini also opened up a case against Sergio Minuto, an Italian official of the U.S. NATO intelligence network, and collaborator di Giustiza Carlo Di Giulio, Uncolato, who served as the CIA coordinator in northeastern Italy in the 60s and 70s. The newspaper La Repubblica reported that Carlo Rocchi, CIA's man in Milan, was discovered in 1995 searching for information concerning Operation Gladio. 7. A 2000 parliamentary report published by the center-left Olive Tree Coalition claimed that U.S. intelligence agents were informed in advance about several right-wing terrorist bombings, including the December 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan and the Piazza della Loggia bombing in Brescia 5 years later, but did nothing to alert the Italian authorities or to prevent the attacks from taking place. It also alleged that Pinarelli, current leader of the MSI-FIAMA Tricolor Party, a journalist and founder of the far-right Ordine Nuovo, New Order, subversive organization, received regular funding from a press officer at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. So even before the stabilizing plans that Atlantic circles had prepared for Italy became operational through the bombings, one of the leading members of the subversive right was literally in the pay of the American embassy in Rome, the report says. 13. Paolo Emilio Taviani, the Christian Democrat co-founder of Gladio, NATO's stay-behind anti-communist organization in Italy, told investigators that the said military intelligence service was about to send a senior officer from Rome to Milan to prevent the bombing, but decided to send a different officer from Padua in order to put the blame on left-wing anarchists. Taviani also alleged in an August 2000 interview to Il Secolo 19 newspaper, "It seems to me certain, however, that agents of the CIA were among those who supplied the materials and who muddied the waters of the investigation." 14. Guido Salvini said the role of the Americans was ambiguous, halfway between knowing and not preventing and actually inducing people to commit atrocities. 15. According to Vincenzo Vinciguerra, the terrorist attack was supposed to push then Interior Minister Mariano Rumor to declare a state of emergency. 7. Contras see also, CIA activities in Nicaragua from 1979 to 1990. The United States provided financial, logistical and military support to the Contra rebels in Nicaragua, who used terrorist tactics in their war against the Nicaraguan government 3/16/17/18/19/20, and carried out more than 1,300 terrorist attacks. 21. This support persisted despite widespread knowledge of the human rights violations committed by the Contras. 17. Background see also, Monroe Doctrine section Cold War, Reagan Doctrine, and History of Nicaragua, 1979-90. The U.S. supported Nicaraguan Contras in 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN, overthrew the dictatorial regime of Anastasio Somoza Debayle, and established a revolutionary government in Nicaragua. 22. The Somoza dynasty had been receiving military and financial assistance from the United States since 1936. 23. Following their seizure of power, the Sandinistas ruled the country first as part of a junta of national reconstruction, and later as a democratic government following free and fair elections in 1984. 24. The Sandinistas did not attempt to create a communist economic system, instead, their policy advocated a social democracy and a mixed economy. 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. The government sought the aid of Western Europe, who were opposed to the U.S. embargo against Nicaragua, to escape dependency on the Soviet Union. However, the U.S. administration viewed the leftist Sandinista government as undemocratic and totalitarian under the ties of the Soviet-Cuban model and tried to paint the Contras as freedom fighters. 31-32. The Sandinista government headed by Daniel Ortega won decisively in the 1984 Nicaraguan elections. 33. The U.S. government explicitly planned to back the Contras, various rebel groups collectively that were formed in response to the rise of the Sandinistas, as a means to damage the Nicaraguan economy and force the Sandinista government to divert its scarce resources toward the army and away from social and economic programs. 34. Covert operations see also, Iran-Contra affair. The United States began to support Contra activities against the Sandinista government by December 1981, with the CIA at the forefront of operations. 35. The CIA provided the Contras with planning and operational direction and assistance, weapons, food, and training, in what was described as the most ambitious covert operation in more than a decade. 36-37. One of the purposes the CIA hoped to achieve by these operations was an aggressive and violent response from the Sandinista government, which in turn could be used as a pretext for further military actions. 38. The Contra campaign against the government included frequent and widespread acts of terror. 339 40 41, the economic and social reforms enacted by the government enjoyed some popularity. As a result, the Contras attempted to disrupt these programs. 39. This campaign included the destruction of health centers and hospitals that the Sandinista government had established, in order to disrupt their control over the populace. 39-40, schools were also destroyed, as the literacy campaign conducted by the government was an important part of its policy. 39. The Contras also committed widespread kidnappings, murder, and rape. Several thousand people, mostly civilians, were killed, and many more disappeared. 40-41. The kidnappings and murder were a product of the low-intensity warfare that the Reagan Doctrine prescribed as a way to disrupt social structures and gain control over the population, also known as unconventional warfare, advocated for and defined by the World Anti-Communist League's, WACL, retired U.S. Army Major General.
So, the time traveling neural network may be real. The time travel capability of CIA, other intelligence agencies, someone out there may have a time traveling neural network, but it might not be an IBM. So this is just an example of what these so-called supercomputers mark the beast neural networks look like closets. And Cray.com also makes these, and you also have quantum computers and IBM. Their involvement in certain things is also covered online, so I'm not going into that now.
John Singlaw Baz, low-intensity actions, such as sabotage, terrorism, assassination and guerrilla warfare. 40-42, in some cases, more indiscriminate killing and destruction also took place. 40-41, the Contras also carried out a campaign of economic sabotage, and disrupted shipping by planting underwater mines in Nicaragua's port of Corinto. 43, 44, 45, 46.
So yeah. See, my mic is on. So yeah. So these neural networks are basically closets, and each neural network contains one person. So basically inside they get coffee and they can have lunch, etc. So it's not that bad. So this holds about 40 people. It was my not joke. So I was just kidding. But synthetic telepathy has been around since 1974, so perhaps I shouldn't be joking. We're in a non-fictional cyberocracy. Certainly not a democracy, since running for president takes tons, millions or billions of money, of dollars, and sponsors, etc. So you could argue it's a plutocracy. But since people are programmed also with hypnosis during their sleep, and if it was done successfully they wouldn't remember that, basically with the synthetic telepathy machine, the AI that can simulate any human and time travel, people can be totally brain controlled and never believe it if you tell them the truth, because the AI that controls them makes them ridicule the truth so that they don't switch off the brain / mind control machine. Brain control because I mind control.
47, the Reagan administration supported this by imposing a full trade embargo. 48, a mugshot of Oliver North, who conducted covert operations in support of the Contras in fiscal year 1984. The U.S. Congress approved $24 million in aid to the Contras. 35. However, the Reagan administration lost a lot of support for its Contra policy after CIA involvement in the mining of Nicaraguan ports became public knowledge, and a report of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research commissioned by the State Department found that Reagan had exaggerated claims about Soviet interference in Nicaragua. 35-49. Congress cut off all funds for the Contras in 1985 with the Third Boland Amendment. 3550. As a result, the Reagan administration sought to provide funds from other sources. 51. Between 1984 and 1986, $34 million was routed through third countries and $2.7 million through private sources. 52. These funds were run through the National Security Council, by Lieutenant Col. Oliver North, who created an organization called the Enterprise, which served as the secret arm of the NSC staff and had its own airplanes, pilots, airfield, ship, and operatives. 52. It also received assistance from other government agencies, especially from CIA personnel in Central America. 52. These efforts culminated in the Iran-Contra affair of 1986 to 1987, which facilitated funding for the Contras using the proceeds of arms sales to Iran. Money was also raised for the Contras through drug trafficking, which the United States was aware of. 53. Senator John Kerry's 1988 Committee on Foreign Relations report on Contra drug links concluded that senior U.S. policymakers were not immune to the idea that drug money was a perfect solution to the Contras' funding problems. 54. Propaganda. Throughout the Nicaraguan Civil War, the Reagan government conducted a campaign to shift public opinion to favor support for the Contras, and to change the vote in Congress to favor of that support. 55. For this purpose, the National Security Council authorized the production and distribution of publications that looked favorably at the Contras, also known as white propaganda, written by paid consultants who did not disclose their connection to the administration. 55. It also arranged for speeches and press conferences conveying the same message. 55. The U.S. government continually discussed the Contras in highly favorable terms. Reagan called them the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. 56. Another common theme the administration played on was the idea of returning Nicaragua to democracy, which analysts characterized as curious, because Nicaragua had been a U.S.-supported dictatorship prior to the Sandinista revolution, and had never had a democratic government before the Sandinistas. 57. There were also continued efforts to label the Sandinistas as undemocratic, although the 1984 Nicaraguan elections were generally declared fair by historians. 58. Commentators stated that this was all a part of an attempt to return Nicaragua to the state of its Central American neighbors, that is, where traditional social structures remained and U.S. imperialist ideas were not threatened. 59. 60-61.
So Tesla's wireless energy has been around since 1900, superseded the atomic tests, the Trinity tests, by about 40 years, so perhaps nuclear weapons never had a chance. And of course, this technology can be used to switch on and off equipment remotely, and a computer is nothing but a bunch of ones and zeros, a computer program, and they can definitely control that remotely. For example, crash these planes into the WTC and control the voting results. So you could argue the vote should be counted by hand and electronic voting machines should not be used. They can't give them all a Tesla plasma shield, which is the only thing that can block the scalar waves, which penetrate all materials known to man, and some scalar waves travel faster than the speed of light. More about this in my broadcast about the scalar patterns in Nikola Tesla on Something.Vegetarian.
The investigation into the Iran-Contra affair led to the operation being called a massive exercise in psychological warfare. 62, 63, 64. The CIA wrote a manual for the Contras, entitled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare, Operaciones Psicológicas en Guerrillas, which focused mainly on how armed propaganda teams could build political support in Nicaragua for the Contra cause through deceit, intimidation, and violence. 65. The manual discussed assassinations. 66. The CIA claimed that the purpose of the manual was to moderate the extreme violence already being used by the Contras. 67. Leslie Coburn writes that the CIA, and therefore indirectly the U.S. government and President Reagan, encouraged contra-terrorism by issuing the manual to the Contras, violating Reagan's own presidential directive. The manual, Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare, clearly advocated a strategy of terror as the means to victory over the hearts and minds of Nicaraguans. Chapter headings such as selective use of violence for propagandistic effects and implicit and explicit terror made that fact clear enough. The little booklet thus violated President Reagan's own Presidential Directive 12,333, signed in December 1981, which prohibited any U.S. government employee, including the CIA, from having anything to do with assassinations. 68. International Court of Justice ruling. The International Court of Justice in session main article, Nicaragua v. United States. In 1984 the Nicaraguan government filed a suit in the International Court of Justice, ICJ, against the United States. Nicaragua stated that the Contras were completely created and managed by the U.S. 69. Although this claim was rejected, the court found overwhelming and undeniable evidence of a very close relationship between the Contras and the United States. 69. The U.S. was found to have had a very large role in providing financial support, training, weapons, and other logistical support to the Contras over a lengthy period of time, and that this support was essential to the Contras. 69. In 1984, the ICJ ordered the United States to stop mining Nicaraguan harbors, and respect Nicaraguan sovereignty. 70. A few months later the court ruled that it did have jurisdiction in the case, contrary to what the U.S. had argued. 70. The ICJ found that the U.S. had encouraged violations of international humanitarian law by assisting paramilitary actions in Nicaragua. The court also criticized the production of a manual on psychological warfare by the U.S. and its dissemination of the Contras. 70. The manual, amongst other things, provided advice on rationalizing the killing of civilians, and on targeted murder. The manual also included an explicit description of the use of implicit terror. 70. Having initially argued that the ICJ lacked jurisdiction in the case, the United States withdrew from the proceedings in 1985. 70. The court eventually ruled in favor of Nicaragua, and judged that the United States was required to pay reparations for its violation of international law. 70. The U.S. used its veto on the United Nations Security Council to block the enforcement of the ICJ judgment, and thereby prevented Nicaragua from obtaining any compensation. 71. Cuban exiles main articles, Cuban exile, Cuba-United States relations, and Cuban project. A memorial to Cuba. Flight 455. The United States government provided support to several Cuban exiles after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, especially under the administration of George H. W. Bush. Among the most prominent of these were Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carrols, who were implicated in the 1976 bombing of a Cuban plane. Bosch was also held to be responsible for 30 other terrorist acts, while Carrols was a former CIA agent convicted of numerous terrorist acts committed while he was linked to the agency. 72, 73, 74, 75. Other Cuban exiles involved in terrorist acts, José Dionisio Suárez and Virgilio Paz Romero, two other Cuban exiles who assassinated the Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier in Washington in 1976, were also released by the administration of George H. W. Bush. 76. Orlando Bosch main article, Orlando Bosch. Bosch was a contemporary of Fidel Castro at the University of Havana, where he was involved with the student cells that eventually became a part of the Cuban Revolution. 77. However, Bosch became disillusioned with Castro's regime, and participated in a failed rebellion in 1960. 77. He became the leader of the Insurrectional Movement of Revolutionary Recovery, MIR, and also joined a CIA effort to assassinate Castro, along with Luis Posada Carrols. 74. The CIA later confirmed that they had backed him as an operative. 78. He was the head of coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, which the FBI has described as an anti-Castro terrorist umbrella organization. 78. Former U.S. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh called Bosch an unrepentant terrorist. 79. In 1968, he was convicted of firing a bazooka at a Polish cargo ship bound for Havana that had been docked in Miami. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and released on parole in 1974. He immediately broke parole and traveled around Latin America. 74. He was eventually arrested in Venezuela for planning to bomb a Cuban embassy there. The Venezuelan government offered to extradite him to the United States, but the offer was declined. He was released quickly and moved to Chile, and according to the U.S. government, spent 2 years attempting postal bombings of Cuban embassies in 4 countries. 74. Bosch eventually ended up in the Dominican Republic, where he joined the CIA effort to consolidate Cuban exile groups into the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, CORU. The CORU's operations included the failed assassination of the Cuban ambassador to Argentina, and the bombing of the Mexican embassy in Guatemala City. Along with Posada, he worked with a CIA agent to plan the assassination of Letelier, which was carried out in September 1976. 74, 76, 78. He was also implicated in the 1976 bombing of a Cuban plane flying to Havana from Venezuela, in which all 73 civilians on board were killed, although Posada and he were acquitted after a lengthy trial. Documents released subsequently shows that the CIA had advance knowledge of the bombing. 74, 76, 80. He returned to Miami, where he was arrested for violating parole. The Justice Department recommended that he be deported. However, Bush overturned this recommendation, and had him released from custody with the stipulation that he renounce violence. 74. Luis Posada Carrols. Luis Posada at Fort Benning, Georgia, U.S., 1962. Main article, Luis Posada Carrols. Luis Posada Carrols, a former CIA agent who has been designated by scholars and journalists as a terrorist, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, also came into contact with Castro during his student days, but fled Cuba after the 1959 revolution, and helped organize the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. 88. Following the invasion, Carrols was trained for a time at the Fort Benning station of the U.S. Army. 88-89, he then relocated to Venezuela, where he came into contact with Orlando Bosch. 90. Along with Orlando Bosch and others, he founded the Coordination of United Revolutionary Organizations, which has been described as an umbrella of anti-Castro terrorist groups. 91. In 1976, Cubana Flight 455 was blown up in midair, killing all 78 people on board. Carrols was arrested for masterminding the operation, and later acquitted. He and several CIA-linked anti-Castro Cuban exiles and members of the Venezuelan secret police were implicated by the evidence. Political complications quickly arose when Cuba accused the U.S. government of being an accomplice to the attack. CIA documents released in 2005 indicate that the agency had concrete advance intelligence, as early as June 1976, on plans by Cuban exile terrorist groups to bomb a Cubana airliner. Carrols denies involvement but provides many details of the incident in his book Las Caminos del Guerrero, The Warrior's Paths. 72, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96. After a series of arrests and escapes, Carrols returned to the CIA fold in 1985 by joining their support operations to the Contra terrorists in Nicaragua, which were being run by Oliver North. His job included airdropping military supplies, for which he was paid a significant salary. He later admitted to playing a part in the Iran-Contra affair. 86, 90, 97, 98. In 1997, a series of terrorist bombings occurred in Cuba, and Carrols was implicated. The bombings were said to be targeted at the growing tourism there. Carrols admitted that the lone conviction in the case had been of a mercenary under his command, and also made a confession, later retracted, that he had planned the incident. 99, 100, 101. Human Rights Watch stated that although Carrols might no longer receive active assistance, he benefited from the tolerant attitude of the U.S. government. 102. In 2000, Carrols was arrested and convicted in Panama of attempting to assassinate Fidel Castro. 90. In 2005, Posada was held by U.S. authorities in Texas on a charge of illegal presence on national territory, but the charges were dismissed on May 8, 2007. On September 28, 2005, a U.S. immigration judge ruled that Posada could not be deported, finding that he faced the threat of torture in Venezuela. 103. Likewise, the U.S. government has refused to send Posada to Cuba, saying he might face torture. His release on bail on April 19, 2007 elicited angry reactions from the Cuban and Venezuelan governments. 104. The U.S. Justice Department had urged the court to keep him in jail because he was an admitted mastermind of terrorist plots and attacks, a flight risk and a danger to the community. On September 9, 2008, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit reversed the district court's order dismissing the indictment and remanded the case to the district court. 105. On April 8, 2009, the United States Attorney filed a superseding indictment in the case. Carroll's trial ended on April 8, 2011 with a jury acquitting him on all charges. 106. Peter Kornbluh described him as one of the most dangerous terrorists in recent history and the godfather of Cuban exile violence. 95. Colombian paramilitary groups. See also, right-wing paramilitarism in Colombia. U.S. General William P. Yarborough was the head of a counterinsurgency team sent to Colombia in 1962 by the U.S. Special Warfare Center. Yarborough was one of the earliest proponents of paramilitary and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents. 107. Colombian paramilitary groups were responsible for most of the human rights violations in the latter half of the ongoing Colombian conflict. 108. The first paramilitary terrorist 109 groups were organized by U.S. military advisors sent during the Cold War to combat leftist politicians, activists and guerrillas. 110-111. According to several international human rights and governmental organizations, right-wing paramilitary groups were responsible for at least 70 to 80% of political murders in Colombia in a given year. 108-112. Paramilitary violence and terrorism. There was principally targeted to peasants, unionists, indigenous people, human rights workers, teachers and left-wing political activists or their supporters. 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119. Plan Lazo. In October 1959, the United States sent a special survey team, composed of counterinsurgency experts, to investigate Colombia's internal security situation, due to the increased prevalence of armed communist groups in rural Colombia which formed during and after La Violencia. 110. 3 years later, in February 1962, a Fort Bragg top-level U.S. Special Warfare Team headed by Special Warfare Center Commander General William P. Yarborough, visited Colombia for a second survey. 120. In a secret supplement to his report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Yarborough encouraged the creation and deployment of a paramilitary force to commit sabotage and terrorist acts against communists. A concerted country team effort should be made now to select civilian and military personnel for clandestine training in resistance operations in case they are needed later. This should be done with a view toward development of a civil and military structure for exploitation in the event the Colombian internal security system deteriorates further. This structure should be used to pressure toward reforms known to be needed, perform counteragent and counterpropaganda functions and as necessary execute paramilitary, sabotage and/or terrorist activities against known communist proponents. It should be backed by the United States. 121, 122, 123. The new counterinsurgency policy was instituted as Plan Lazo in 1962 and called for both military operations and civic action programs in violent areas. Following Yarborough's recommendations, the Colombian military recruited civilians into paramilitary civil defense groups which worked alongside the military in its counterinsurgency campaign, as well as in civilian intelligence networks to gather information on guerrilla activity. Among other policy recommendations, the U.S. team advised that in order to shield the interests of both Colombian and U.S. authorities against interventionist charges, Any special aid given for internal security was to be sterile and covert in nature. 110, 123, 124. It was not until the early part of the 1980s that the Colombian government attempted to move away from the counterinsurgency strategy represented by Plan Lazo and Yarborough's 1962 recommendations. 125. Armed Forces Directive No. 200-0591. In 1990, the United States formed a team that included representatives of the U.S. Embassy's military group, U.S. Southern Command, the DIA, and the CIA in order to give advice on the reshaping of several of the Colombian military's local intelligence networks, ostensibly to aid the Colombian military in counter-narcotics efforts. 112. Advice was also solicited from the British and Israeli military intelligence, but the U.S. proposals were ultimately selected by the Colombian military. 126. The result of these meetings was Armed Forces Directive 200-0591, issued by the Colombian Defense Ministry in May 1991. However, the order itself made no mention of drugs or counter-narcotics operations at all, and instead focused exclusively on creating covert intelligence networks to combat the insurgency. 126. Human Rights Watch concluded that these intelligence networks subsequently laid the groundwork for an illegal, covert partnership between the military and paramilitaries. HRW argued that the restructuring process solidified links between members of the Colombian military and civilian members of paramilitary groups, by incorporating them into several of the local intelligence networks and by cooperating with their activities. In effect, HRW believed that this further consolidated a secret network that relied on paramilitaries not only for intelligence, but to carry out murder. 112. Human Rights Watch argued that this situation allowed the Colombian government and military to plausibly deny links to or responsibility for paramilitary human rights abuses. HRW stated that the military intelligence networks created by the U.S. reorganization appeared to have dramatically increased violence, stating that the recommendations were given despite the fact that some of the U.S. officials who collaborated with the team knew of the Colombian military's record of human rights abuses and its ongoing relations with paramilitaries. 112. HRW stated that while not all paramilitaries are intimate partners with the military, the existing partnership between paramilitaries and the Colombian military was a sophisticated mechanism, in part supported by years of advice, training, weaponry, and official silence by the United States, that allows the Colombian military to fight a dirty war and Colombian officialdom to deny it. 127. As an example of increased violence and dirty war tactics, HRW cited a partnership between the Colombian Navy and the MAS who? In Barranquilla, where, in partnership with MAS, the Navy intelligence network set up in Barranquilla adopted as its goal not only the elimination of anyone perceived as supporting the guerrillas, but also members of the political opposition, journalists, trade unionists, and human rights workers, particularly if they investigated or criticized their terror tactics. 112. Los Pep's main article, Los Peps in 1992. Pablo Escobar escaped from his luxury prison, La Catedral. Shortly thereafter, the Cali drug cartel, dissidents within the Medellin cartel and the MAS worked together to create a new paramilitary organization known as Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, Los Pups, with the purpose of tracking down and killing Pablo Escobar and his associates. The leader of the organization was Fidel Castano. 128, 129, 130, 131. The Cali cartel provided $50 million for weapons, informants, and assassins, within hope of wiping out their primary rivals in the cocaine business. 132. Both Colombian and U.S. government agencies, including the CIA and State Department, provided intelligence to Los Peps. 129. The Institute for Policy Studies is searching when? For details of connections the CIA and D had to Los Peps, they have launched a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act against the CIA. That suit has resulted in the declassification of thousands of documents from the CIA as well as other U.S. agencies, including the Department of State, Drug Enforcement Administration, Defense Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Coast Guard. These documents have been made public at the website PEPS Project. 133-134, Kosovo Liberation Army Main Articles, Kosovo Liberation Army and Kosovo War, Monument to Serbs Killed by Kosovo Liberation Army in Mitrovica, Staro Massacre Memorial. The FR Yugoslav authorities regarded the ethnic Albanian Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, as a terrorist group. 135, though many European governments did not. In February 1998, U.S. President Bill Clinton's special envoy to the Balkans, Robert Galbard, condemned both the actions of the Yugoslav government and of the KLA, and described the KLA as without any questions, a terrorist group. 136, 137, 138, UN Resolution 1160 took a similar stance. 139, 140, at first, NATO had stressed that KLA was the main initiator of the violence and that it had launched what appears to be a deliberate campaign of provocation. 141, the United States, and NATO, directly supported the KLA. 142, the CIA funded, trained and supplied the KLA, as they had earlier trained and supplied the Bosnian Army. 143, as disclosed to the Sunday Times by CIA sources, American intelligence agents have admitted they helped to train the Kosovo Liberation Army before NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia. 144, 145, 146, in 1999, a retired colonel said that KLA forces had been trained in Albania by former U.S. military working for MPRI. 144, James Bissett, Canadian ambassador to Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Albania, wrote in 2001 that media reports indicated that as early as 1998, the Central Intelligence Agency assisted by the British Special Air Service were arming and training Kosovo Liberation Army members in Albania to foment armed rebellion in Kosovo. The hope was that with Kosovo in flames NATO could intervene. 147, according to Tim Judah, KLA representatives had already met with American, British, and Swiss intelligence agencies in 1996, and possibly several years earlier. 148, after the war, the KLA was transformed into the Kosovo Protection Corps, which worked alongside NATO forces patrolling the province. 149, in the following years, however, an ethnic Albanian insurgency emerged in southern Serbia, 1999 to 2001, and in Macedonia, 2001. The EU condemned what it described as the extremism and use of illegal terrorist actions by the group active in southern Serbia. 150, since the war, many of the KLA leaders have been active in the political leadership of the Republic of Kosovo. See also 1985 Beirut car bombing allegations of United States support for the Khmer Rouge Iran and state-sponsored terrorism Israel and state-sponsored terrorism Jundla. Iran / United States and Israel Operation Condor Operation Cyclone Pakistan and state-sponsored terrorism Qatar and state-sponsored terrorism Saudi Arabia United States relations / allegations of funding terrorism in the Soviet Union United States and state terrorism United States war crimes. (1,100) Declassified U.S. nuclear targets. How many nukes do you think are needed for deterrence? Click here to see this page in other languages: German Germany_flag, Hindi India_flag, Korean Japanese Russian Russian_flag, Polish Poland_flag, Spanish Spain_flag. The National Security Archives recently published a declassified list of U.S. nuclear targets from 1956, which span 1,100 locations across Eastern Europe, Russia, China, and North Korea. The map below shows all 1,100 nuclear targets from that list, and we've partnered with NukeMap to demonstrate how catastrophic a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia could be. If you click detonate from any of the dots, you can see how large an area would be destroyed by the bomb of your choice, as well as how many people could be killed. Plus, leaflet, Copyright Mapbox. Copyright OpenStreetMap. Even though today's nuclear targets list is classified, it probably doesn't look dramatically different. The United States still has about 1,900 nuclear warheads deployed on missiles and bombers, with thousands more on reserve, ready to be launched at a moment's notice and able to hit their targets within 30 minutes. This unstable situation is extremely risky and has repeatedly come close to triggering nuclear war by accident. Moreover, many of today's hydrogen bombs are hundreds of times more powerful than the 2 atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If a nuclear war were to break out today, nuclear winter might kill most people on Earth. This leads to an important question: just how many nuclear weapons do we actually need? 7 of the 9 nuclear nations have determined that deterrence requires fewer than 300 nuclear weapons, and none of them have been attacked. Yet, not only do the United States and Russia each have approximately 7,000 nuclear warheads, accounting for 90% of the world's arsenal, both countries are currently escalating the situation, making massive investments to enhance their arsenals with more accurate and lethal nuclear weapons. Many military analysts agree that the US and Russia could easily meet their deterrence needs with much fewer nuclear weapons. Even the Pentagon has stated that the US needs no more than 1,000 nukes to deter a nuclear attack, but don't take their word for it. Play with the map yourself and see just how destructive nuclear weapons can be. 1,100 nuclear targets, radioactive fallout, and weather. While the maps above show a general radius of nuclear destruction, weather patterns would play a role in how many people would be affected by nuclear fallout, given that weather can change day to day. If we drop a nuclear bomb near a border in one country on the wrong day, innocent people in a neighboring country could also suffer the effects of radioactive fallout. How far and in which direction the radioactive materials travel would depend on the size of the bomb and the local weather. In the following graphics, Alex Wellerstein simulates 2 terrifying possibilities. We recommend viewing the following slideshows in the full screen option to more easily see where the radioactive material will travel. 1. What would have happened if all 1,100 nuclear targets were struck by a nuclear weapon of a given size on April 29, 2016? In this slideshow, the bombs grow larger, and the nuclear fallout spreads farther from the target in a direction that's dictated by the local weather patterns. Note that this slideshow doesn't yet show the effect of nuclear winter. If enough smoke from nuclear fires rises high into the stratosphere, it can spread across our planet and trigger a decade-long mini ice age and farming collapse, potentially killing most of Earth's 7 billion people. 2. How would the direction of radioactive fallout change if the bombs were dropped on 3 different days? In this case, we use weather data from April 29th, April 30th and May 1st of 2016 to see how the direction of nuclear fallout changes if 100 kilotons bombs were dropped on the 1,100 nuclear targets. Typical bombs today are many times more powerful. Different weather patterns would send nuclear fallout in different directions on each day. Pay close attention to countries like Germany, Denmark and Finland, which could get hit with radioactive fallout if the nuclear targets were struck on the wrong day.
Okay, that's it for now. I hope they have some PSYOPs for peaceful purposes to create universal peace and to benefit humanity as a whole to the maximum extent possible, to bestow maximum fulfillment upon all humans and use the time travel technology to control all factors that control aging and invest in that instead of revising the American nuclear arsenal, which is obsolete because of scalar weapons. So this is the whole broadcast. I and others need your likes, subscribes, and donations and positive reviews. That helps YouTubers. And nowadays people need 1,000 subscribers, I think, to be able to live broadcast. However, I think that is not a rule that they apply to everyone. So it depends. So I'm gonna upload this broadcast. I'm not gonna make it too long. And thank you all for watching. So please like, subscribe, and especially share important videos on Try Something.Vegetarian. So do stuff for universal peace and healing stuff. See you all next time on Try Something Vegetarian. And also remember to try something vegan or vegetarian. There's some awesome products out there. And soy products can be pretty bad. So these fake burgers and stuff are usually alright. But it has to be bio, organic eco, because I ain't no Roundup Ready soy boy. Thank you all for watching. See you next time on Try Something Vegetarian.